It is a pleasure. Is it working? Is it working? That is not. Yes, it is indeed a pleasure. I was not supposed to do this, but since I have been asked now, I am doing this. It's a pleasure to introduce our student, Suvendu. Let me begin from the end. As the display says here, that Suvendu teaches and researches in the University of Florida. That itself is a big, huge certificate, right? The second is, his area of interest is post-colonialism and something very specific, right? Post-colonial times and medicine, right? And health. Suvendu studied here in his undergraduate days, I think between 2009 and 2012. The last batch of students before the college became autonomous. The next batch were students from the autonomous college. So, and then he did his postgraduate from development, and as you realize, but he is now in Florida. He's a brilliant student, right? And one thing which you need to emulate. Wait, there is something to emulate already. You see here somebody standing before you from University of Florida who was a student of this college, now on this side. A few years back he was on that side. Now he's here. That should itself be an inspiration, right? The other thing that I would like to say about Suvendu is the way he has worked himself up to this position where he is now. And the last thing, which is about myself. He is a brilliant student. I am no match for him. But I have one small thing which makes me proud. I was one of the referees to introduce him in the University of Florida. I leave this jazz to Suvendu. Thank you, Suvendu.
Thank you so much, sir.
Let me, on behalf of the department, welcome Suvendu with an orange, tendernizing orange, and a piece of bougainvillea, a tuft of bougainvillea. Why orange? Because we usually welcome, on the days of our reunion, the ex-students of our department with oranges. Satyaki would be happy. In fact, he expressed in the last reunion his mild annoyance. Arjun, to me to unlearn our orange. Try orange at least to begin with symbolically. Okay, we'll begin with the intellectual star on the horizon. Suvendu with this orange and a tuft of bougainvillea. Alright? So Suvendu should become an example to you, because I pick up from the last sentence that, or the penultimate sentence that Professor Satyaki has made, that he has worked himself up to this position. When Suvendu came to this department, he was slightly, what you call submissive, subdued, shy. Yes,
But the fire was inside. The fire was inside it.
The fire.
We took time to recognize or understand.
What was inside? Fire or the coal? I don't know. Fire. Which causes fire? But gradually, Suvendu has become, a trailblazer for many of us. In fact, here, I think he's a fan of Suvendu. He's also here from Ghatak University. No? No. Anyway, he has many followers. I know. He has many followers, alright, who want to hear Suvendu talk. In fact, they have urged Suvendu to arrange for such a recording so that they can hear even later on, alright. So we are happy that Suvendu is here.
Although Suvendu will be embarrassed, but he mentioned that he gets a scholarship of $15,000.
How much do you get in terms of dollars?
Am I getting roasted?
Alright. Anyway,
Okay.
Suvendu deserves whatever he gets. Alright. We are, I think, what's the time? We are
So we have 15 minutes.
15 minutes late, which means we will end up at 1:50. And then we will go for a break. We will go for lunch. You also have your break. We will again come back at 2.
Yeah.
2. Alright? At 2 we will begin. Thank you. Our professors of the department, Professor Dibakar, Professor Videography, and Professor Abhishek Pal, they are also present, and I welcome everybody, plus the students. Your attendance will be marked. Alright? Thank you.
That's the ominous last sentence. Okay. Thank you so much, History Sir and Arya, for those really kind introductions. And as they said, I was on the other side of the podium just a few years back, and I was quite shy and all. So, but anyway, so let's get into the lecture right away. So let me first explain the way I have structured these two lectures. As you will see, the first lecture has more slides and more what we can call lecture content. So I exposit the ideas, the argument, examples, etc. And the second one, which is after the lunch, Medical Humanities and Post-Colonial Milieu, that has more of a conversational structure. So I have a series of questions. I have certain cues and all, but I want that lecture to be, or that part of our conversation today to be much more interactive. Okay? And please keep your questions even from this part of the talk for the second part, because I will engage with those. So the lecture is called The Question of Embodiment in the Post-Colony, and as you can see right away, there is a rather kind of sad, morbid, one could say, photograph by Willoughby Wallace Hooper called Those Stricken by the Madras Famine of 1876-78. And one can easily say, okay, so this was a disastrous famine where millions of people died, which was only one among the many colonial famines and epidemics with truly catastrophic mortalities. A historian would argue that, okay, this was a question of the way the food was distributed, or kind of administrative laxity, or the inability of the British government to assess the water levels and so on. There can be any number of reasons. But we would ask this question in a more philosophical manner. What is it that comes from certain fundamental questions of political community and body and so on that leads to this photograph? So what is the huge kind of long philosophical backdrop that we can think of while thinking of this photograph? So we have to, let's begin with working definitions. What is embodiment? It's a very interesting choice. I mean, why am I not calling it the body? Embodiment is a noun made up from the verb form of body, right? Embody. And it suggests bodies as actively engaged entities and thereby materializes an idea. So even when we are talking about the body, after all we are discussing an idea here, right? When we came to this lecture hall, we had all sorts of experiences in the body, maybe in the auto rickshaw when you were kind of jostling with someone to get on, or you were kind of trying to avoid a drain while walking, all sorts of things. You were trying to avoid bird poop. So lots of different triggers which could easily invade our integrity or sanctity or whatever of the body that were present. But at this moment, when we enter this hall, we are primarily talking about ideas. That's why it's embodiment. So it's a bit tricky. There is no real kind of very easy access to body. You have to go through these ideas to get into the idea, get into body in some sense, right? What embodiment also does, it naturalizes a political community and occludes the historical processes that go behind it. So we see that, okay, so certain bodies are supposed to do certain things, right? Like professors are supposed to have this kind of a sweater and sit in an AC hall or whatever, which is not, thankfully today they're not using because I have a cold, but we operate in a certain kind of space, as opposed to that a person who is selling vegetables on the street is operating in a different kind of space. So there are all these different ways that bodies function, which are naturalized, which we think as very natural, but there are historical processes behind it. And then the last question is even more tricky. It's from Marx. Marx asks in this treatise called Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, it's available on the internet. The forming of, and he says, and I quote, the forming of the five senses is the labor of the entire history of the world down to the present, unquote. So although we think that our sense perceptions are the most intimate, most personal, subjective things that we have, even those things have history. And that's why they are so difficult for us to decipher, right? And then the other concept, post-colony. Post-colony, the name might immediately suggest that, okay, post-colony, so after colonialism, but that's not the case. It's not simply what comes after colonialism. It's a state, that's why post-colony, right? It does not give you a sense that, that's why I'm not using post-colonialism, although there are other reasons as well. So it presents a state where there is a sense that colonialism is not simply in the past, it's not simply a relic, quote unquote, or leftover. All these are words used by Anne-Laure Stoller in her great book Imperial Debris. But, and I quote, an active process, a vibrantly violent verb, which is to say, let's say when we go to the college street, we have all these kind of colonial era grand buildings, and then we have all these bookshops, some encroachment. So there are layers and layers of history upon the space, right? So when we are thinking about post-colony as a site like that, then we'll have to think of the active processes that constitute the post-colony at that very moment, rather than just thinking of in terms of what is the leftover of history or what is the relic of the history that still survives. And then post-colony, the word post-colony has been used most famously by Achille Mbembe, who is a great African philosopher. He teaches in South Africa, in this essay called Provisional Notes on the Post-Colony, although he also has a book called On the Post-Colony. And he says in the post-colony is in some sense really marked by the body. So many of you have heard in your post-colonial classes that post-colonialism is all about the discourse, right? The imperial discourse, and then someone critiques it, then someone critiques the critique, and so on. But here we will talk about the body rather than the discourse, and there are reasons behind that, which will become apparent soon. So what happens in the post-colony is the body itself is the principal locale of the idioms and fantasies used in depicting power, unquote. So it's a sort of power, so which has a relation with the Foucauldian definition of power. Of course, it's in some way has a wave-like structure defined through the entanglement of knowledge and political power and different kinds of knowledge and so on. But in some sense, at its very center is the body. And it rather than kind of knowing subject, it's an embodied subject with which we are concerned here. Right? Now let's look at some really hilarious and thought-provoking quotes from Midnight's Children. And I am provocatively calling this slide Midnight's Noses, Pigments and Spittoons instead of Midnight's Children or Midnight's Discourses. Because all of these are very bodily and often kind of overlooked. Because it's very easy for us to talk about, okay, so Salim Sinha, is Midnight Children part of the syllabus?
Yes, in the event.
Okay, so for some of you the text is very familiar. That's very good. So this is a quote, I am Salim Sinha, snot-nosed, stained-faced sniffer, unquote. If you know the story, he is the illegitimate child of Method, who is the colonial officer, and Vanita, who is the wife of a street singer, and then after Noon's Passion and so on, then he is adopted in a different family. But what is really interesting for us is somehow, even though there is no biological connection, he has a similarity in terms of the physiology of the nose with his adopted family. Okay, so he somehow inherits the nose and the knees of the family's great patriarch, whose name is Adam Aziz. And I quote, "Nostrils flaring, curvaceous as dancers," unquote. That's the description of Rushdie uses. He got stabbed in the back recently, I know that. To describe Adam Aziz, and one boatman says that is a nose with which you start a dynasty. So that's a great nose, right? You are a great patriarch because you have a great nose. And the nose very interestingly connects with narration. So it's really, Rushdie says, tongue in cheek, but it's very thought-provoking, very interesting. That the nose is like the trunk of the elephant-headed god Ganesha, right? So somehow Ganesha is the person who writes the Mahabharata. Although Krishna Deva and Vedanta, he kind of narrates it, he speaks, and Ganesha writes. And also to the family. Now he also takes upon certain attributes of Salim's adopted mother, Amina, who is black, interestingly. So she is called Black Mumtaz, although she has luminous skin, but her skin is somehow that of like a South Indian fisherwoman. And every time Salim would do something untowardly, he would not have proper dinner manners and so on, his uncle would say, "Hey, you're black man." So somehow Salim is a black person. Although, I mean, so that's how what we can call some kind of a pigmentocracy that works in that novel. And when Amina marries someone who is very fair, so his adopted father is very fair, Amina's cousin actually flirts with him that, okay, we are the pink ones, we are white, so even those blackies know that we are really the beautiful ones and so on, right? So why does that become so significant? Because at the end of the novel, and I am of course not summarizing the plot, but if you read the novel, there are all sorts of interesting things that happen, and Salim kind of ends up being in Karachi, right? He is born in Bombay, but there are all these, the fates of all these countries, India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, all of them are tied in Midnight's Children, right? And there is an airborne spittoon, literally. Spittoon is a pot where you throw the betel juice. That kind of appears in a weird way to him. He's stuck with, he's literally hit, and then he loses his brain. And that's a very normal thing to have. Like he loses his brain because it's a heavy object and so on. But what interesting thing happens is he acquires a certain kind of ability to sniff all sorts of things. So he can sniff now characters, he can predict things by sniffing. So instead of his very mindful ability to narrate, which is presented in the earlier part of the novel, so he's like Ganesha, so he's more of a mind person. Now he becomes a body person. He can sniff and he becomes happier, although he is in some way he's literally out of his brain, right? And he hugs that beloved spittoon and so on. And all of these will become apparent. Like, why am I saying all of these things? But just remember this, that somehow smell, the power of the smell becomes a different way of knowing in Midnight's Children, as opposed to the way of knowing with which he starts initially, right? And then here are some quotes from Kutze's great novel, Waiting for the... All these novels are must read. If you want to know post-colonial studies, the very basics, I would suggest that it's better to read these novels rather than just read lots of theories, right? So this is a long quote, but a very interesting and important one. Here, the magistrate kind of makes love with an indigenous woman who is captured, and that's what he thinks about her body. And I quote, "With this woman, it is as if there is no interior. So she is all surface, only a surface across which I hunt back and forth, seeking entry. Is this how her torturers felt, hunting their secret, whatever they thought it was?" Right, unquote. So I'm not going into the quote anymore. So somehow her body is like a map, right? And we would see, if you read a lot of even critical literature, like there is a very famous book called Imperial Leather by Anne McClintock. There, McClintock uses the idea of why the map becomes a metaphor for the body, and the body somehow becomes the embodied map and so on. All these connections are there. In Midnight's Children is a very interesting novel. I'm not a huge mad fan of Rushdie. I think many of his later novels might be slightly whatever. But Midnight Children is an absolute masterpiece. So you should really read it closely. There are lots of, it's a storehouse of ideas. So here Salim is assessing his teacher, Mr. Emil Zagallo, who, and I quote, claimed to be Peruvian and was fond of calling us jungle Indians. So here there are two groups of erstwhile colonized people who have really racist ideas about each other. So this teacher thinks that these are jungle Indians. I am more civilized than them. And then the students don't spare the teacher either. So, and I quote, we called him Pagal Zagal, Crazy Zagallo, because of all his talk of llamas and conquistadores and the Pacific Ocean we knew, and with the absolute certainty of rumor that he had been born in a Mazagaon tenement and his Goanese mother had been abandoned by a decamped shipping agent. So somehow he is related, he is like a, within quotes, bastard child of the conquest, the Spanish conquest of the Americas, who has turned up in Bombay. Because there are also all these connections with the Portuguese Empire, right? Because initially we know that Pope divided the world into two halves, and he said between the Spanish and the Portuguese, and he said to the Spanish, go to the west and whatever you find, that's yours, and to the Portuguese, whatever you find in the east, those are yours. So that's why Malacca and all those kind of places are Portuguese colonies, and Brazil is the only Portuguese colony in Latin America, the rest are Spanish ones. But then now we have got another idea, right? That maps are bodies are somehow related. So just keep these things in mind. We have got that somehow body can be an alternate mode of knowing. We have also got an idea that bodies and maps are interrelated. Let's move on. Now we will get into the real intellectual stuff. Till now you might be thinking, what is this? It's just some quotations from books, but no, I have some stuff that will give you a headache, be assured. So here are 2 points that I have pulled from Plato and Aristotle, which in some way everything about Western philosophy and critical theory in general starts with the Greeks, right? So Plato has an idea of the body socius. I am not calling it social body for a very specific reason, but somehow the society is structured like a body, and the body, the organs of the bodies are identified in terms of the hierarchies of society. So Plato thinks that, and I am sure you know from the Republic, that there is no way we can access the ideal, the universal, the abstract form in this world, right? Because body, what body participates in form, it's a very specific word that he uses. I mean, it's translated as thrice removed from reality and so on, but it's the more specific idea is that body is some kind of a matter that participates in form. It's like a soap that has some kind of a stamp or some kind of a wax stamp, right? So it has a stamp, the body has the mark of the soul, but it's distorted. It's not ideal. It cannot be conceived in its true form, right? So that's what he thinks of the body and the mind. And the mind and the soul are interchangeable in Greek philosophy, unlike Indian philosophy. In Indian philosophy, there are 3-part division, in Greek there are 2. So on the one hand is the body matter, and the other hand is the soul mind form. And the souls can migrate from one part of the one body to another, metempsychosis. I'm sure Arya referred to it while teaching Macbeth somewhere. But in Timaeus and Laws, so more kind of Plato's treatises which are more dry but more concerned with political theory, unlike Republic. Republic is very philosophical, although it appears that it's a political commentary, but it's not. In Timaeus, Plato suggests that the creation of the human body has been done in terms of a layout of a city. So the divine soul is located in the head, and the head is also related to the philosopher king. And the mortal soul in the chest, tribes of desires in the torso, who represent the lower strata of the society. So you might be reminded of Manusmriti a bit here for very good reasons. He also reiterates the same point in Laws. And it's also related to the medical doctrine of Hippocrates. What we need to remember is if you read, for instance, Rabindranath closely, you will see that Rabindranath reads all sorts of stuff. So he's interested in physics, he's interested in chemistry. That's how you become a great thinker, and that's true for everyone. Don't think that Plato was attending philosophy classes in UG on past course and writing republican laws. He was actively engaged with these doctors and lots of other branches of knowledge. So everyone was interdisciplinary across history, anyone worth thinking. So that's Plato. What Aristotle does is, Aristotle has this idea of the body politic. He is the originator of this idea of the body politic in some sense. He reverses the very idea. So the body is in mattered form. So the body is the actuality of the form. There is no other way we can access form but through the body. Because he is also a biologist and Plato is a mathematician. So they have different kinds of approaches. So basically we don't need to get into all these details, you can go into the slides. What he basically says is our body is the only way we can access the idea, right? So that's the main point that we need to remember. And somehow the political community is also structured as a body where the whole is always greater than the parts. The same as his theory of tragedy. It's always the whole which is greater than the part. So somehow the whole political community is conceived as an organic body, which becomes a really powerful metaphor and a very powerful idea throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So that's why we see all these things about the king's bodies and kings having two bodies, biological and political and so on. Right? So I'm skipping the Middle Ages because I'm sure while teaching Macbeth, Arjuna has talked a little bit about it, and there are kings, two bodies and so on, which you can look up, you can read Quentin Skinner. And I will jump right into the Enlightenment, which is the big...
In the banquet scene, the banquet table, it presents the body.
Right, absolutely. So, exactly, and they drink, as you said in our class, they drink from the same vessel, so they become the part of the same body. And it basically comes from the Christian idea of transubstantiation, like partaking in Christ's blood, right? And that's how you pledge your loyalty. But something, so that was a continuous tradition, right, till the Renaissance. There are all these different stances, but basically we can think of this conjunction between the biological and the political body. But the real break comes with the Enlightenment, because Descartes, he tries to found philosophy, to posit philosophy upon the mind, so that it can become truly universal, and everyone can have, we have all different bodies. We come from different strata of the society, we have all these hierarchies in the real world, but as we enter the realm of philosophy, somehow we want to be equal, right? So he says, cogito ergo sum in Meditations on First Philosophy, I think therefore I am, and tries to build philosophy without any prior assumption on the plane of the mind. And this is a mode of reconciling the Christian sense of immateriality of the soul with the physicalist framework. I am not going into like nitty-gritties of that. But he makes a very interesting point. So what happens about other animals? They are like, they have the extension, they have the body, but they don't have the consciousness. So they are like automata. They are like, they have the God's design implanted within it, and their body just functions mechanically, going about its purpose, without making any real true changes. That is the mainstream argument. But actually Descartes was also very invested in biology, like Plato and Aristotle. So he has this book called Treatise of Man, which he published much after Meditation on First Philosophy, and he makes a very interesting point. He tries to connect the body and the mind through the pineal gland, which is at the back of our, kind of at the conjuncture of the head and the spine, right? And he says this is the principal seat where soul exerts its power upon the body and shapes our thoughts. So that leaves a question about which many people have debated. So are humans some sort of philosophical zombies? So are we also seized by ideas which then kind of work through us, and we also function like an automaton? So that danger is also there in Descartes. So now we have got the philosophical foundation of this whole mind-body debate. Now we'll look into the political nature of it, because we got a little bit of it while talking about Aristotle and Plato, but much of that changes in the 17th century. Why? because of English Civil War and the republicanism and the new state. The state is being founded, right? So for the first time there is a sense that the state represents the common will as well as the common body of the citizenship, and it's not just dictated by some kind of an enlightened king. So in 1651, Hobbes, who is a very great, most important political philosopher before Marx, I would say, he writes this book called Leviathan, and this is the picture of the Leviathan, this one, and who is the king, and he's like the head of the people, and he is connected with the body of the people through social contract. So it's like the pineal gland that connects the head of the state with the body of the state, and although the head is paramount, in some sense for the first time it's accepted that it's not a natural relationship, it's done through social contract, so it's historical. So there is no divine right of the kings. Somehow people have invested power in the sovereign. But it is the next treatise I am going to talk about is a much less known treatise. But why is it important? Because it locates the body of the citizen in the colony. It's called the Commonwealth of Oceania, and it's by James Harrington. And there were all these books about the southern continent, Oceania, utopia, lots of utopia about that, because it was supposed to have some sort of an ideal returning republic which is isolated from the world and so on. And he has a very concrete biological model of the political community, and he draws upon the circulatory system theory of William Harvey, and he calls it political economy. And he literally uses very strong kind of biological metaphors. So he says a model government, and I quote, must embrace all those muscles, nerves, arteries and bones which are necessary to any function of a well-ordered commonwealth. Right? So we need to pull up the strength of all sorts of citizens because they have all these different parts in some way. Why is that important? Because then that leaves a question that somehow the artery or the uterus or whatever, like any part of the body, all of those have some thinking function too. All of which will become clear why these things are important. Just keep that in mind. That body now has some kind of a political agency in the 17th century. Now I am going to discuss a really interesting philosopher very briefly, Immanuel Kant, who is the next big name in the Enlightenment after Descartes. And if we read the very well-known books of Immanuel, he is extremely obscure and difficult to read. But if you read Critique of Pure Reason, much to your pain, you would realize that he is very concerned with the mind. He says all these things like equality is based on some kind of a reciprocal ethics where you are investing in someone's idea of freedom and so on. So let's not go into it. But for us the question is, what does Kant think about the body, right? Because that's the main question that we are perceiving through all these questions. And he very interestingly hierarchizes the sensible body, because he thinks the seat of reason and the seat of law is the mind. So what does the body do? Body still offers some kind of an intuition, some kind of a map, but its senses are hierarchized. So the noblest of the senses is sight, and the sight is also related to the European. So the European is like the sight, it's like the Plato's head in some sense, although now it has become racialized. And in the bottom rungs of those senses are smell and touch. Touch is absolutely at the bottom of it, and senses is the penultimate one. And while explaining the disagreeable nature of the smell, he makes a very racist comment, but it's very important to note. So he thinks that basically it's really good that quote unquote the Negro quote unquote is black, because somehow his pigment stops him from evaporating the stenches that he has, because through all these things about phlogiston through the lungs, etc., these are kind of 18th century ideas about how there is heat produced in the body and it kind of creates smell and all that. He thinks that unlike the white man who represents the I and who is really the embodiment of the mind, this person is not only the embodiment of the body, but of smell, of disgust in some sense, right? So there we have a conjunction between colonial anthropology and philosophy that is being established at the very heart of the Enlightenment. So one might ask, so are all these European philosophers racist? Is there any kind of someone who has given us very different kind of model? I will talk about that later. I will come to this slide later. Actually the structure is not right. But now comes Darwin in the mid-19th century, who gives us the idea of the evolution. So India becomes a very important theater where all these races are intermingled. And as you can see, there are all these books about phrenology and physiognomy which are coming up, and of course Sukumar Rai is making fun of that. Tor munduta photoscope diye dekhi, tate ghiye ki ashe ittadi. All these are very tacit and sarcastic references to phrenology. But what is for us to remember, what is very important for us to remember is India is very important because India is considered to be a land of degenerate Aryans, and there are lots of people who are talking about it. Starting from William Jones to Holbrook and so on. Earlier they talk about it in a more philological manner, so how Sanskrit is related to Greek and Latin, and later it gets more and more, it acquires more and more biological and racial idiom. And here Darwin is saying this, and I quote, hundreds of imperceptible gradations may be traced from the black squat tribes of the mountains to the tall olive-colored Brahman with his intellectual brow, calm eyes and high but narrow head. So like the Brahman is somehow a little bit like the European, although degenerated. And quote unquote, the tribes, they are like the Aborigines, right? So they should have different laws for them. And all these things are naturalized within the colonial law. So there is, so in other words, it's also important for us to remember is that the high philosophy, and Darwin is not just your homespun racist, because he has really complex idea about how the body mutates and evolves in the origin of the species. But when it comes to its application in terms of creating apparatus of administration, it requires a different character. So we need to read philosophy across those levels, how it's practiced and how it's conceived, right? And then I have a quote from this doctor, he is very famous, J.R. Martin, he comes in my dissertation a lot. He says a very interesting things, because Indians are suffering from all these epidemics a lot, especially malaria and cholera in this period. He says that Indians have, and I quote, aptitude of all substances to pass from the inorganic to the organic, unquote. So it uses a very kind of a chemical and microbiological vocabulary, but what it basically says is their cell membranes are unable to resist the force of nature. They are more feminine, so these forces invade those inorganic things, become part of the organic because of their laxity of frame. And there are all sorts of reasons, and even social reformers jump into it. So Trilokanath Mukhopadhyay would say that because of early marriage and overuse of the sexual function, their bodies have become really lax, and some of which you can even read in the books you get here about celibacy and continence, which also has the same ideas behind it, that somehow you need to be continent sexually to keep the frame, right? So what does all of this create? Now we will go back to our questions. Why the famine happened despite all that all those lines of great philosophy? And there are no reducing Immanuel Kant or Darwin or those people just to those basis ideas. So there are two aporia which we can identify. One is the materiality of what I am calling materiality of identity and identity of matter. So how far identity can be dissociated from materiality, or even if we call ideation or the thinking of philosophy, right, the very nature of thinking, how far that can be disembodied, or is it embodied thoroughly? So here is a quote from Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, and this is a book that everyone should read who has some interest in post-colonial studies. And Fanon comes to Europe after he learned psychoanalysis in France, and he practiced practiced in Martinique. But when he returns, he has this really interesting observation. So he says that he is being observed by a woman and a child in the streets. That's the scene. And the child starts crying. The child is frightened by his presence, because it's the big black man who is really frightened. So what happens in that moment? And I quote, he says that his whole self transmutes into an object. A slow composition of myself as a body, sealed into a crushing object, unquote, becoming an object in the midst of other objects. Right? So in that moment, this great person whose book is introduced by the greatest French intellectual of that time, Jean-Paul Sartre. So he is very well known and recognized in the intellectual circles. So there is no qualms about that. So like pay really close attention to what he is really saying. I mean, this might appear to be just an angry kind of response to casual racism, but it's not. So his mind, Fanon's mind, might be considered equal in stature with that of Sartre, and they can have an intellectual discussion in equal whatever. But when this guy goes into the street, and you cannot really have that experience of racism unless you go to a country like the US or the UK, like I did. Only then you can experience it very viscerally with your body in some way, if you encounter instances of racism. So he gets crushed into objecthood. And there is another really interesting debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar that I have quoted here, which also has similar trajectories. So it's a response of Gandhi to Ambedkar's vindication of annihilation of caste. Gandhi responds to it by writing this essay called A Vindication of Caste in Arya. And what he is saying is, he is drawing upon the notion of idea, that okay, if we really closely read Manusmriti, some people even might argue, like Patrick O'Leary does and lots of great thinkologists does, that we can understand it to an extent at a philosophical level differently. That the callings of a Brahmin, and this is a quote from Gandhi, the callings of a Brahmin, spiritual teacher, and a scavenger are equal, and their due performance carries equal merit before God, and at one time seems to have carried identical reward before man. So somehow the Varnashram system, it has degenerated into a very, into literally casteist social practice, but somehow at the level of idea, the body and the mind are equal, or different kinds of bodily practices can be equal. Right? So you can go to a temple and do puja, or you can be a manual scavenger in the street. Somehow both these practices of the body are equal. Philosophically, that's what Gandhi says. And what for us is interesting to note is Ambedkar is not refuting Gandhi in terms of his knowledge of the philosophy. He is not saying that okay, this is something you are misinterpreting. But he is making a very original point, that the same that Aristotle made in some sense. That because we will have to concern ourselves with the enmattered body, right? Like enmattered idea, how the idea has manifested and not the idea itself, that creates the problem. So and I quote, for in India, man is not scavenger because of his work, he is a scavenger because of his birth, irrespective of the question whether he does scavenging or not, unquote. Right? So something very essential gets tied to the body. Right? There are certain association which becomes part, the very atoms of the idea that constitute the matter, which cannot be dissociated. So that's aporia number one. Before we go into that more concerns the post-colony, as you can see, a country like India. So anytime you read a post-colonial text and you just bash the British, which you should do, we need to also think of this other longer and arguably much more pervasive structure of inequality, caste. Because and there is no way really to, I mean, I'm not talking about these things because I'm not really qualified to talk much about caste because I'm not a scholar of caste. But whenever you talk about biology or body seriously in the post-colonial context, there is really no way of dodging the question. It's really fundamental. We need to remember that. So if you need to really seriously engage with it, you will have to engage with it. Now we'll go to the West again and bring in the question of gender in some way. So there is one guy, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, in the Western canon itself, and he's a great follower of Kant, who in some way gives us an idea of an embodied philosophy, right? So it's a very different kind of philosophy that he wants to create, and he's not much followed. I mean, after Merleau-Ponty, unfortunately, there comes the great fashion of structuralism and post-structuralism, which again takes it back to the realm of the signifier, the realm of the semiosis, realm of language, rather than engaging with the question of body in some sense. So, Ponty argues that the only, and I quote, unjustifiable certitude of a sensible world and thereby the only unjustifiable certitude of philosophy can be body. So thereby he inverts the Cartesian model of thinking from the mind. And how does he conceive the body? He says that the body is at once sensible and sentient. So it responds to senses, but it also does back to objects. So it also does something actively. That's how body functions. Flesh and chiasm. Chiasm is a very interesting idea. So he gives us an example of a handshake where two persons shakes hand. They are really kind of an embodied performance of equality or exchange is performed. And at some level, when two people are holding their hands, in some way, do they become one hand? Do we even know where the flesh of one person ends and where the other begins, right? So in the same way, if we, but in some way, the surface of the skin which touches, that's also the chiasm, that's also the differentiation that begins the self, right? That starts some kind of a nascent practice of self. And in the same way, if we go back, every time an idea is created by getting differentiated from one sense perception or the other, right? So here is water. It has a certain kind of liquidity, viscosity, whatever. It has a certain kind of shape because it's part of the bottle. So it's very sensory. But when we are thinking of the idea of the liquidity or the idea of the viscosity and so on, we are differentiating from its sensory nature. But that differentiation is never complete. That's why it's like the Derridean trace in some way, if you know about the trace. So the signifier and the signifier endlessly kind of creating loops, but in some way the connection is never lost in the idea of the chiasm. And here he defines the chiasm much better than I would, so I am quoting him. And I quote, the idea of chiasm, that is, every relation with being is simultaneously a taking and a being held. The hold is held. It is inscribed in the same being that it takes hold of. Starting from there, elaborate an idea of philosophy. It is the simultaneous experience of the holding and the held in all orders. Right? So at the same time you are enveloping and being enveloped and connecting and being connected, and that's how actually, if we really think at an atomic level, that's how thought functions. Not by being cut off from all sense perception and became kind of working as a philosophical zombie, right? As Descartes says. Okay, but then there is another interesting aporia, which there is no way of evading, even if we follow the model of Merleau-Ponty. So, why? Because for the person for who almost becomes, whose self almost becomes a metonymy for their body, for them, it can create a metaphysics of corporeality, right? So you are just body. You are body in its proliferating and kind of sprawling substance, but you are nothing but the body. And here is a quote from Mbembe, from his critique of black vision. The black man is above all a body, gigantic and fantastic, member, organs, color, a smell, flesh and meat, unquote. So how do you bring in a different kind of sense, because then you will have to change the nature of what we understand as disgust, what we understand as fear, and so on, because all those have been naturalized. Remember, Marx said that that's the really complex history, the complex of the senses. It's much easier if you think of the history of ideas. Then there is another important point that Luce Irigaray makes. I'm really sorry. I should write Irigaray here, and I would. This is a quote from Irigaray, "The Invisible of the Flesh," which is a commentary on Merleau-Ponty. And Irigaray was a great follower of Merleau-Ponty and also his student. But he makes this really key critique. So, what is the unspeakable ground of philosophy even in Merleau-Ponty? It's the way the biologically cells get generated. So the carnal and the maternal, which are in some way interconnected. And this is a quote from Irigaray. "Maternalizing flesh, reproduction, subsistence there of the amniotic, placental tissue." So note how close to medical humanities this is. There is no other way of thinking about philosophy seriously without thinking of biology as well. Which enveloped subject and things prior to their birth, this reversibility of the world, and I suggest some repetition of the prenatal sojourn. So every time a cell is created, every time you are sensing something, you are somehow in a closed economy of the utero. You are again back to that prenatal sojourn, and if you are really want to think about it, then you have to think with that, right? And then these are all big ideas, but I am loading with all of those because they will be very useful in our second part. So bear with my piling up of complex ideas. Here is a really important book by Gopal Guru and Sundar Sarkar called The Cracked Mirror. It's about the caste. So Sarkar makes a distinction between two kinds of touch. One is sparsha and the other is samyoga. Both can be called touch or contact. But how are they different? And I quote, "If two bodies are in contact with each other, then that contact is a symmetrical relation, like the handshake. Each body is in contact with the other. However, in the case of touch, there seems to be an asymmetry, since the person who touches is at the same time not being touched by the object. So necessarily when you are touching something, it's not a given that you are also being touched. So it's something that it can be a repulsive touch. It can be a touch that retracts. It can be all sorts of, or it can be a touch like you do to যখন মানে সেই আরতির পর প্রদীপ ঘোরানো হয়, do we really touch it? এবং কেন টাচ করি না সেটা আমাদেরকে খুব ফিলোসফিক্যালি চিন্তা করতে হবে, কারণ ওটার মধ্যে যে পরিমাণ আইডিয়া ইজ যে you can take heat from it, but don't put your hand in the fire literally for all sorts of reasons. Yeah. So here is the kind of the basic end of my presentation. I end this talk with lots of questions, as you can imagine, as you must have. But what we will try and do in the second part is we will try to think with the body, right? And don't think that Indian philosophical system does not give you an idea. I have talked about Merleau-Ponty and so on because that's more customary. In post-colonial studies, you are supposed to quote elite French philosophers. But if you have some interest in, for instance, মানে চণ্ডী যদি পড়ো, for instance, বাংলাতে বলছি না, ইংরেজিতে বলে লাভ নেই, সেখানে দেখতে পাবে যে যখন চণ্ডিকার ধ্যান করা হচ্ছে, হরিহর ব্রহ্মা বিরচিত, সেখানে দেখবে যে শরীরের এমন কোনো ফ্লুইড নেই, একদম কফ মূত্র থেকে বীর্য সবকিছু থেকে শুরু করে সব জায়গাতেই কোনো না কোনো দেবী আছে, ঠিক আছে? কণ্ঠে তুমি অমুক, জিহ্বায় সরস্বতী, ভ্রুমধ্যে কালিকা ইত্যাদি কেন? So that's what is this link between the body and the maternal that is being established, and what philosophy resides in that? We'll have to think about that. Okay, thank you so much.
Suvendu, it is 6 minutes past 1. We still have some time.
Okay, so
round up at 1:15. So if anyone wants to ask any question, Suvendu, at this juncture, one may go ahead. But Suvendu, first of all, please explain this title, the term aporia to the boys.
Aporia aporia is a very interesting word. It has two different meanings in two different. So in rhetoric, aporia means a turn of speech. So like you are being clever. It comes from the sophist. So you are using something to really not engage with the idea. But in philosophy, aporia means a philosophical problematic which, so there is no clear. It's like a riddle. If you know your Mahabharata, you know that Vyasdeva gave some bass scooter to Ganesha, so that he need to think about those things while writing, right? So in the same way, philosophy presents certain riddles, so certain kind of deliberate obstacles, so that you will have to. So in some way, what Arjuna is asking me to do, I can't oblige, I can't explain aporia in some way. You will have to face the obstacle and the darkness of the aporia. And aporia, if I am going further into philosophy, it's related to the idea of the kora and the maternal again in Plato's game and so on. So it also has a relation with the maternal.
Yeah, this is very interesting because as you were talking about Maurice Merleau-Ponty, I mean Merleau-Ponty initiated what you call in the 20th century this philosophical tradition of existentialism in a way. Now there, for example, in Kafka's the trial, the whipped is also whipped. Alright, now once again this engagement, the one hand which is touching the other, I mean we are all linked, and it becomes difficult for Joseph K. to understand the crime that he has committed. Is it a crime in some idea, at the level of idea, or at the level of some material manifestation? Alright, and he is puzzled because he cannot decide that whether it is an offense of the body or offense of some stellar spiritual condition. And that is why critics are also, in a kind of in a state of undecidability, because some say it goes back to original sin, alright, because we cannot pinpoint what Joseph K's offense was. And on the other hand, Joseph K has to disentangle himself, from all the institutions which are physical, which materialize what is offense. In a way, inscribe offense in some material action. And that is why in this Kafka's novel, The Trial, there is so much emphasis on materiality, because they keep changing their dress, eating the breakfast which belongs to someone else. Alright, this has always been very puzzling. This I felt.
That's a great reading, actually. And I'm sure that the reading you are giving, I have not read any paper that talks about it. It can become a paper. You want to write it. Or if someone else, is generous.
You can go ahead and
because it's really important, because I don't want to really go into the complexity of existential philosophy, but it has some really key interaction with the idea of the body, because Ponty and which is also used by Sarkar, they use two different words in the same way, like Guru and Swarupa is suggesting Sparsha and Samyoga. One is noesis and the other one is noema. So there are two ways of knowing through the senses. One is more like an invading sort of sensation. There knowledge is thrust upon you very viscerally, or punishment or knowledge, whatever. One is you are trying to make contact because you are trying to matter forth, or you are trying to body forth some kind of an idea, right? So what you are saying is, yes, K is really puzzled whether he is tied to a really inscrutable, unknowable idea that creates all these structures. And I really like the way you use the metaphor of entanglement. The way he can probably save himself from punishment is entangling from all these material manifestations
Because
in some.
existentialism, you have this idea how this subject is related to the world of the phenomenon. Alright, this interaction. That is yours.
Yes. So yeah, and there is all these things about the bad faith and so on in Sark especially that makes it much more complicated. Like when I am speaking here, in some way I am using my tongue, etc. But is it a bad faith gesture? Am I behaving like a waiter in a restaurant? So am I really just playing a role, or is it something? Is my body bringing forth some kind of an idea in its authenticity? So that's also a question, right? So that's another aporia. So to what extent? So all of you, please watch Kantara, because that the movie. It's a Carnatic movie, and এটা আপনারাও দেখুন না, সবাইকে বলবো, এসটি কে বলবো, KANTR Kantara. এখন বোধহয় উঠে গেল, but this is a Carnatic movie. It's set in southern Tamil Nadu, and I'm not giving away the plot, but it's about a performance, a dance performance, and the question is performing মানে একটা জঙ্গলে আর কি, সেই জঙ্গলটা বিভিন্ন সময় অনেক অ্যাক্রস টাইম ঘটনা ঘটে, জমিদার সেটা নিয়ে নিতে চায়, ফরেস্টের লোকেরা ওখানে রিজার্ভ ফরেস্ট বানাতে চায়, লোকে ড্যাম বানাতে চায়, ইত্যাদি ইত্যাদি। এবার সেই জঙ্গলটা একজন ডেমিগডের, একজন দৈবী, যার সঙ্গে অনেক কিছু জঙ্গলের দেবতা বা জঙ্গলের শক্তি পশু টসু সম্পর্ক আছে, এবং সেখানে অবভিয়াসলি ফরেস্ট ডুয়েলার্স আছে। এবার তারা যখন পারফর্ম করে তখন মানে দেবতা একরকম ভাবে বলে যে এটা করা চলবে না, করা চলবে ইত্যাদি। এবার সবাই মনে করে যে এটা আদৌ কি দেবতা বলছে, এটা ওরা নিজেদের সুবিধার জন্য গ্রামটাকে বাঁচানোর চেষ্টা করে। So that's the problematic there, because you brought in this question of performance and authenticity as well. Ventriloquism. So where does my body end? That's also a key question, especially raised in Shakta philosophy in India. Does my body, ওই যে শেষের দিকে মানে আবার আমি খুব একটু রিলিজিয়াস vocabulary ইউজ করছি, বাট ফর দ্য পারপাস অফ ক্রিটিক্যাল ফিলোসফি, বিকজ দেয়ার ইজ নো রিজন হোয়াই উই শুড নট ইউজ ইট, তাই না? মানে ওয়েস্টে আমরা যদি ক্রিশ্চিয়ানিটি থেকে ফিলোসফি তৈরি করতে পারি, তাহলে এখানে কেন করবো না? দেখবে তোমরা যে ওই আমি যে ইয়েটা উল্লেখ করলাম স্তোত্রটা, ওটা শেষে অদ্ভুত সব কথা আছে যে বাম দিকে অমুক বিরাজ করছে, ঊর্ধ্বে এইসব ভূত আছে, একটা লেভেলে ভাবতেই পারো যে these are just referring to supernatural beings, but because the whole hymn was about really about your tissue, your body, your seminal fluids, your urine and so on, even all those things are embodied by one form of the goddess or the other. So you realize that even those directions or everything, all those things, they are also in some way a subtle manifestation of the body in that way. Even that is not external, right? I mean, where the body ends, that's a very important and puzzling question.
14 minutes past 1. So maybe just one more brief question. I don't know the answer will be brief. But one question. You can ask questions again later on.
That's it.
Any question? Yes, please stand up, introduce yourself, and ask the question.
Sir, I am Ghosh from University. Sir, in the beginning of the lecture, you were saying that you can equate the body with a man. So, sir, my question is that, so if we take, for instance, if we take dance, his mistress going to bed, in which he addresses his beloved is America, the newfound land which he wishes to explore. So, can we say that Dan is actually speaking about colonial exploitation by conceiving his approach within the shell of erotic conceit?
I mean, it's in a way pretty obvious, the use of the name America and so on. So I would say that because all these things are pretty much in the air in Europe by that time, right, when Dan is writing, the colony of Virginia has been established. So there is also a British colony in the Americas. So yes, and but the more interesting question would be, and I have not read that poem recently, and it's very hard for me to comment on a poem that is fictitious. So to what extent? To what extent because it's an erotica. To what extent the power of the narrator is present, or does he surrender to the charms of the America and thereby get subjugated in some complex ways? Am I making sense?
One answer you get in Narendrapur's book, Race and Colonialism, in Shakespeare's plays, that book. I think it was the title, full title, Race and so on. Now, there, Narendrapur traces the cultural tradition where female body, alright, and land, alright, they have been telescoped together.
Yeah, obviously.
This was there.
Three, even the very idea of the metaphors are beer.
And the further the land, more exotic is the body.
Yes.
Unfamiliar land, so the body becomes more erotic, more tantalizing,
right.
more tempting to explore.
Right. Absolutely.
I think we have to shut our shop here and then proceed to our respective menus of lunch and then again come back at 2 o'clock. Alright?
Rejuvenation of body. Okay, welcome back. So the second part of the lecture is called Medical Humanities in the Post-Colonial Milieu, and as I said in the first part of our lecture, that this part will be more interactive, and I will give less of an explanation. So the opening picture is very interesting. A skeleton is contemplating a skull. So kind of it suggests some kind of a medical or somatic examination by the human subject themselves. This is an image from the University. So I always start with the definition. So what is medical humanities? It's a very simplistic definition that I have given, but nevertheless I think we need to have one such. So this is basically an interdisciplinary field which is still emerging in the UK and in the US. Medical humanities is also taught in medical schools. It's part of the medical curriculum these days. Although they have a different kind of focus. So in the medical school we need to have certain notions of the human subject, the idea of the human personhood, or what is the nature of the term, how do we deal with terminal illnesses and so on. They are more concerned with those questions. On the other hand, in the humanities or in the social sciences, people are concerned with how certain biological ideas of community or personhood or gender belief and so on, they have shaped literary or historical or philosophical texts. So it can come from both these different science. It can come from the humanities as well as from the sciences, right? And the last part of my working definition is important because even for people who are going to the medical school, medical humanities suggests that it has a constructivist view of medicine as well as suffering, illness, everything. What is that? In philosophy, something which is constructivist is something which is constructed in a very specific space and time, so it has some contingent ideas which can shape across time and place and community and so on. Rather than a positivist, which means this is basically true, which we might think what happens with science, right? That's not the case. Okay, so medical humanities is slightly different from medical history, although it often relies on a historical framework. So medical history, of course, has a very rich tradition in different parts of the world. So if I talk about some of the seminal medical historians of the world, I have to talk about Alfred Crosby or John McNeill Miller, both of whom have worked on the Atlantic. But here I have given you some names of historians who have specifically worked on South Asia. So for instance, David Arnold, he has all his books are very well known. Colonizing the Body, State Medicine and Epidemic Diseases. He talks about how epidemic diseases in the British India kind of create the state apparatus, right? right? So create the infrastructure of public health as well as the state's intervention in people's health. So who gets treated or how treatment is defined, etc. etc. Disease, science, technology and medicine in colonial India, that also has the same kind of template. The tropics and the travelling gaze, this is a very interesting and great book. Here Arnold engages with a lot of travelogues, and it's very interesting for literary scholars because he suggests that the idea of tropic, initially India was conceived as part of the Orient. It continues to be conceived as the Orient, but from the middle of the 19th century, it more strongly gets aligned with the idea of the tropic. And the tropic has certain parameters like overbearing nature, overbearing power of nature over the human, or epidemic diseases, as well as some kind of an idea of mystery, primitivity, and so on and so forth. So as the empire spreads from the port cities into the heartland of India, it gets gradually connected with the idea of the tropic more and more. Mark Harrison's Climates and Constitutions is also a very important book. I'm not going to summarize all these books for you. Just remember, this is like a good bibliography. Okay, so Projit Bihari Mukherjee's books, Nationalizing the Body, I have not mentioned the name of the books in the slide, Nationalizing the Body and Doctoring Traditions. These are the two books he has written. Both of them are very interesting because unlike Arnold or Harrison or Poonambala or Deepak Kumar, he argues that in India, the situation is not as if science is imposed from the outside, right? For all of these historians in the previous column, all of them have this idea that these are indigenous bodies who are treated by the Western science. So they become kind of the great Foucauldian framework. These are the docile bodies which are disciplined and so on and so on. But Projit Bihari Mukherjee suggests that in India what happens is more like science and technology comes from both sides. So what we know as the Daktari medicine, Daktari korate jawa, seta kintu it's not just an adaptation of Western medicine. It becomes absolutely apparent if you go to see a physician in the US. You are treated very differently. এখানে দেখবে ডাক্তাররা বলবে এটা খাবে না, এটা শরীরকে গরম করে, ঠান্ডা করে, বা বলবে এই জন্ডিসের পরে কাঁচকলা খাবে, লাউ ডাঁটা খাবে, সো অন। এইগুলো কিন্তু ওয়েস্টার্ন মেডিসিনে বলার কথা না। জাস্ট বলবে ম্যাগনেসিয়াম সাপ্লিমেন্ট নাও, ব্লা ব্লা, এই ওষুধ খাও ইত্যাদি। So these are coming from Ayurveda. Many you take vapor when you catch cold to remove nasal congestion. ওর কম্পোজিশনটা দেখবে ওর মধ্যে প্রচুর রকমের আছে। তো এইরকম ভাবে দেখা যায় এবং দ্যাট ইজ ইন আ ওয়াইডার কালচারাল সেন্স there is a negotiation that is taking place because the first person who dissects the body, Madhusudan Gupta, he was a trained Ayurvedic physician before. So he, in his books, the way he presents these ideas is not simply an adaptation of Western medicine at all. Then Shinjini Das's Vernacular Medicine, that's also a very important book. It kind of relates the beginning of the Swadeshi or the self-reliant vision of the self-reliant nation and the conceptualization of homeopathy as self-care. And every family should have homeopathy. Homeopathy somehow becomes this family medicine, although it's a German kind of a medical system, right? So why does it become vernacularized? Under what conditions? That's the right. And then Rohan Devraj's Malarial Subjects is also a very important book with which I engage a lot because I write, I think on malaria, think about malaria. So Rohan Devraj argues that there is no kind of stable malaria that happens across time, right? It gets a certain definition under certain contingent circumstances. So one of his major and really thought-provoking idea is that malaria is distinguished from other fevers in terms of how it responds to quinine. So we usually think there is a disease and then there comes medicine. But he says the medicine comes first in some way. And then the medicine goes on to define the disease. If it does not respond to quinine, maybe it's something else. It becomes that. Okay. Now let's dig into the real elephant in the room, which is medical humanities, which is not exactly medical history, of course. because in our first part we talked so much about certain senses and somatic ideas which kind of shape the state as such, the thinking about the state, right? So how Hobbes think about the absolutist state, or how Harrington thinks about the liberal state. Those ideas are rooted in one notion of the body or the other. So medical humanities thinks about those much more philosophical in some sense, or humanistic you can call, necessarily kind of generally some broader questions than medical history, which is of course concerned more with explaining specifics a lot more. So these are some of the key ideas of medical humanities. Medical humanities as a critical discipline is fairly new, although as I said, medical humanities is being taught, especially in the US from the 1960s in medical schools as well as, like, you need to have certain notions about human dignity to be a doctor, or doctors, you would find in conferences on medical humanities in the US, doctors coming with poetry, or they have some kind of illness narrative which they are trying to use as a mode of diagnostics, etc. So those kinds of soft medical humanities of course existed, but medical humanities is a critical, more philosophically invested discipline about which we would be interested because it would cause a headache, right? That kind of medical humanities is fairly recent. So you need to read Edinburgh Companion to the Critical Humanities, for instance, a key book, and as you can see it was published only in 2016, so it's fairly new. Let's now talk about two major ideas in medical humanities, and I have been fortunate enough to interact a lot with both these persons, because one of them, Pamela Gilbert, is my supervisor literally, and Priscilla Ward is also someone whom I correspond with quite a bit. So Priscilla Ward has this idea of the outbreak, which is a major idea. What does it mean? She has this book called Contagious: Cultures, Careers and Outbreak Narratives, where she analyzes the structure of disease narratives. So when you read, for instance, Edgar Allan Poe's The Dance of Red Death, or Bleak House, so many texts in the 19th century, 20th century and so on, which has a, or think even about, for instance, Bergman's The Seventh Seal, right? So across all these, so these texts are written in very different historical circumstances. They respond to etiologically different diseases. They have different thematic concerns. But is there some common theme that runs through all of them? Can you give me one such theme that comes to your mind? If you have read a text which discusses disease in some sense. Calcutta chromosome, yeah, it talks about malaria, Ronald Ross and so on. Jodio Calcutta chromosome
in Pother Pachan. Can gram ke gram ujaya huiya Chandra to
exactly.
Such narratives intermingled,
exactly.
Social migration and all.
Exactly. So social migration is a very good point. So Ward, for instance, says that the outbreak narrative invariably articulates some notion of community which is both microbial and political. Okay. Why does she choose to connect the microbial and the political? Because এই যে বিভূতিভূষণ শরৎচন্দ্র এতে গ্রামের পর গ্রাম ম্যালেরিয়ায় উজাড় হচ্ছে, এবং ওখানে অনেকগুলো কি জিনিস ম্যালেরিয়ারই, যেমন দুর্গা ম্যালেরিয়ায় মারা যায়, ফর ইনস্ট্যান্স 3 দিনের জ্বরে মারা গেল, কিন্তু তুমি যদি দুর্গার ইফ ইউ লুক এট দ্য স্পেসিফিক ডেসক্রিপশনস দ্যাট আর ইউজড, ঝোপের মধ্যে ভিজছে যেখানে ইত্যাদি, and if you read medical text along with it, so it's a question of methodology. A medical humanities scholar would read medical text and literary text together so that they can understand certain kind of metaphors or certain ideas that travels across those texts, right? তখন আমরা দেখব যে ওর সাথে কয়েকটা খুব কি অনুষঙ্গ আছে, যেমন the train that always runs. এবার ট্রেনটা of course it's the call of the city or call of the vast unknown, একটা অচেনার আনন্দ ইত্যাদি, কিন্তু at the same time if we look at a very material implication of the spread of the railways in India, it is the single most reason behind the big malaria epidemics. because it altered the whole landscape of especially Bengal, and there were huge cases of waterlogging along the railway tracks, and there are historians who have talked about it. But as a medical humanities scholar, Pather Pachal is a very good example. Let's stick to it. So Durga dies of fever, but Upu does not, and he actually ends up going away from the village. So what does that tell us about the nature of gender that's being articulated in this text, and how does that get connected with a certain vision of malaria itself? So if we read, for instance, medical texts, we would see that malaria is a disease of degeneration, so that connects with village. But it also affects people who have the laxity of frame, famously, right? That's what J.R. Martin says. So it hits the colonized, it would affect the colonized woman the most. She is the most physically permeable in some sense. So all these different layers of meanings come together in the idea of the outbreak, whenever the idea of the outbreak is created. But actually what Priscilla defines as the outbreak is not the kind of outbreak that we are talking about when we are talking about Pather Pachali. Because in Pather Pachali, it's a more sustained and long durée crisis, right? It never goes away. It hits across generations, and it works in texts that also spreads across time. অনেক পরের আমরা টেক্সটেও দেখতে পাবো, যেমন ধরো পথের দাবি 1920, পথের দাবি যে সব্যসাচী, he shivers now and then, and he always has a muffler, although he changes his dress every now and then and changes his identity. That's one of his key markers, that now he is known as a doctor, now as an engineer, here he is someone, there someone else, but he gets a shiver every now and then. So malaria is now the part of his very embodiment, and the way the revolutionary masculine self is imagined is not someone who is immune to malaria, unlike the tough bodies of the colonizing masculine subject we see in lots of other previous texts like Philip Meadows Taylor, some of Kipling, although Kipling is a bit more complex. But certainly what happens in Pather Dabi is malaria gets internalized and embodied, but then you learn to literally make it part of your performance. It becomes a kind of, that's why the police thinks এই লোকটা কাঁপছে আর কি হবে, এই নিশ্চয়ই ডেঞ্জারাস নয়, ওর হাতের মধ্যে গাঁজার দাগ এবং কাঁপে, এবং he does not look very virile. So that adds to his kind of armor of being a revolutionary in some sense, his vulnerability. তার মানে কি, in other words, we have to think of outbreak in a different way from the post-colonial milieu than what Priscilla has defined it to be. Although it's a very useful and key and fundamental philosophical definition, in the post-colonial milieu, outbreak can kind of appear in a different manner. The next very important idea is that of social bodies, by Pamela K. Gilbert. She has 3 books on cholera. She is a scholar of the Victorian period, of course. Priscilla Ward is an Americanist, and more she writes across the late 18th to mid 20th century literature, lots of science fiction, etc. But Pamela Gilbert writes on, for instance, Dickens, and she is definitely a Victorianist. So how does she define the social body? The social body is a mass of standardized and defined bodies, where bodily equivalence, often in terms of identical potentials for spreading diseases, inscribes equivalent subjectivities. What does that mean? So, in the body socius that we discussed with Plato, it has some kind of an idea of social body, but it's precisely not equal, right? That's why the head is related to the philosophical king. The thighs are related to the mass with the under the throes of desire and so on. But what paradoxically the social body does is, although it takes the idea of that organic social body from a very ancient tradition, it equalizes bodies. Not because they are equal in very affirmative senses. So they are not equally rational subjects, for instance, right? Or they are not even subjects who deserve equal treatment from the law in some ways. You will see there are lots of patronizing passages in Dickens, Bleak House. But the danger lies, they are equally contagious. So even a lower class woman can infect an aristocratic woman. Even a sweeper like Joe, what happens in Bleak House? He is the narrative thread that connects all these social levels as he sweeps. He is spreading the disease, he is spreading literally the filth of London. And the filth of London cannot be chucked under, it cannot be hidden, because it will come to attack Chesney Ward, it will come to attack the seat of aristocracy as well. So the social body creates a very perverse kind of a liberal idea, something which is not exactly intended, but what must the state now has to negotiate. It's that kind of an idea. But then that idea of social body also gets, but there are some critical distinctions between how the social body functions in Victorian Britain, for instance, where it is conceived. In Chadwick, all these sanitary clauses and Victorian social justice writers like Dickens and George Eliot and so on, and how it functions in the colony. So this is also there in Pamela's book itself. She says that how cholera is perceived in India is very different from how it is perceived in UK. In UK, it's the Asiatic cholera. It's literally, there are references like you can remember Henry Mayhew's London Labor and London Poor, where he says, "Therein lies the Jasor of London." So Tom and Alone, which is a very infamous slum, seat of cholera, now becomes some kind of a Jasor within the heart of England. So there is a spatial mobility which is Gothic. Right? There is an uncanny mobility of space that is happening there. But the Jasor of London is still different from the actual Jasor. Why? Because in India, despite all these big malaria epidemics, there was no really large scale sanitary infrastructure that took shape in its response. Because cholera was perceived as the disease of barbarians, because it's like a temporal stasis, so they are caught in some kind of a time loop. Dipesh Chakraborty usefully calls it the waiting room of history, but we must understand that waiting room is not an air conditioned waiting room, right, where you are just waiting for your voting rights and so on. It is very much more like a disease chamber where you are swept by all these epidemics. So we need to maybe kind of re-inscribe the social body a bit when we are trying to analyze texts from here. যেমন আরোগ্য নিকেতন, তারাশঙ্করে আরোগ্য নিকেতন যদি পড়ো, 3 জেনারেশন ধরে এই ঘটে যাচ্ছে এই গ্রামে, বা ধরো পুতুল নাচের ইতিগত, মারাত্মক টেক্সট। প্রথম টেক্সট শুরু হচ্ছে একজন তাল গাছে হেলান দিয়ে তার মাথায় বাড়ি পড়ছে মারা যাচ্ছে। That's the beginning of the novel. It's like one of the greatest opening sentences. I unfortunately cannot quote the opening sentence because that would be much more powerful. But nevertheless, we need to remember যে এটা কেন হচ্ছে, এবং গ্রামে বারবার দেখবে শশী ডাক্তার, তো এবং ডাক্তার ফিগারটা খুব প্রচন্ড পাওয়ারফুল, প্রচুর ডাক্তার ফিগার আছে ইন দ্য রাইটিং অফ বনফুল, এমনকি হিন্দি লিটারেচার কি বলে প্রেমচন্দ, in Fanishwarnath Renu, Maila Achar, etc. And there are many Bengali doctors. That's also very important. So এই জায়গাগুলো আমাদেরকে দেখতে হবে। এবার আমরা একটু থিওরিটিক্যাল জায়গায় যাই যে what are the lacuna of medical humanities, or what kind of questions that we can ask of it if we are to adopt this discipline in post-colonial milieu. So we have already discussed some of these questions, but these are in a more formal way. How does the condition of health in the post-colony, and what are the conditions of the health in the post-colony? The long duration of epidemics, that's a big question. It becomes part of the social fabric. So if we read Sharat Chandra, কলেরা হওয়া কুকুর বা ম্যালেরিয়া ইনফেস্টেড কুকুর, মরে যাওয়া কুকুর ইত্যাদি, these are the part of the mise en scene. The text is often not even concerned with it at the level of dialysis because it's so naturalized in the setting itself. So we have to devise a way of reading the so-called setting, which is often conceived as more passive. We are just focusing on the event, right? Instead of that, we need to do it. And how does that alter concepts such as outbreak that rely upon a certain measure of normalcy? How do questions of race and caste complicate our understanding of social body. Class and gender, class and gender are slightly more complicated because the body of the lower class woman with its supposed lack of continence became the key template behind an imaginary of the infecting social body. Think bleak house, etc. So that's a more standard thing, but here it gets much more problematized by race and caste. For instance, when the water system comes up in Calcutta, there is a text called Jantrodhrito Jal Shuddhi that discusses whether the water of the Ganges, if it is delivered through pipelines, does that still remain ritually pure, even though it now becomes scientifically pure? Does that take away the ritual purity? সেটা কি গঙ্গা জল হিসেবে পূজোতে ব্যবহার করতে পারবে? তুমি কল করলে গঙ্গার জলই তো আসছে। So these kinds of questions are raised, and they also literally become part of the way the garbage is, for instance, disposed in the Hooghly. The East India kind of the municipality decides to use Hooghly as the drain of the city, partly because it's conceived as the holy river that can never be infected, and we now know what has happened after that, right? And all these cities. কারণ এই জল গঙ্গা জল আমরা নোংরা কি করে হবে, তার বেশি করে নোংরা ফেলবে, because the ritual or perpetually pure থাকে. So that's a way of reducing the cost, of course, because the original plan was to throw the drains into the saltwater lakes. I think that would have been much more costly. And then the third question is, what are the genres that articulate the pathology of the polity? Because that's a key running question that we are exploring from the first lecture, that how the illness of the narrative, illness of the individual and the illness of the collective interact. That's a very fundamental question in any definition of outbreak. It's as old as Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, right? So for the king scene, the plague visits. So there is always a political semantics that's at play whenever there is a disease. But there are certain lacunas of post-colonial critical method too. That's why we probably need a little bit of medical humanities here. Why? Because post-colonial method has famously enveloped the somatic in semiosis, or if one has to be more polemical, one could say that it diverts the attention from a real crisis on the body or the social body into the realm of discourse. So here is a quote again from Coetze's Foe. It's a must read if you want to understand post-colonialism. Look, said Crusoe. I looked. This is the narrator, Mary, but saw nothing in the dark save the glint of teeth, white as ivory. Ivory trade, Africa. La la la, said Crusoe, and motioned to Friday to repeat. Ha ha ha, said Friday. So when Friday mimics, he mimics in a different way. Bhava would say, right? Bhava would say that there are two famous parallel homologies. One is almost the same but not quite. The other is almost the same but not white. But this not white totally dismantles and destabilizes the almost the same that comes before, as we would see. He has no tongue, said Crusoe, gripping Friday by the hair. He brought his face close to mine. Do you see? He said. So he forcibly pulls him and shows his mouth to the narrator. It is too dark, said I. La la la, said Crusoe. Ha ha ha, said Friday. He has no tongue, he said. That is why he does not speak. They cut out his tongue. I stared in amazement. Who cut out his tongue? The slavers. So when he was a little boy, the enslavers, they took him, they captured him and they cut his tongue. And then the post-colonial discourse famously begins around the silence. So here is a great kind of an exemplary post-colonial reading by Elec Boehmer, who is a great post-colonial scholar, and I have learned much from, of course, Boehmer, and she's a great critic. But it's a very symptomatic of the problem post-colonial studies has in negotiating with the viscera. So how does Boehmer interprets it? Friday's dumb mutilation becomes its own sign. So immediately from the history of slavery and the ivory trade and all the powerful metonymies that we are given, it immediately becomes a sign. And then she goes on, and I quote, this is perhaps one of the key distinguishing features of the post-colonial, the conversion of imposed dumbness into self-expression. So famously, the silenced country would speak through Salim Sinai, for instance, right? That's literally written on the blurb of Midnight Siren. But nobody is concerned with the way the spittle hits, or they are much more powerful bodily, somatic, visual details, which are extremely important. But what do we lose? So this is a question I am asking. When we quote, transfigure the body into the narrative that Boehmer asks us to do, what if we stay with the scarred body instead? And what kind of historicity would that articulate? So how would we find a different kind of history if we were to stay with the body a little bit longer? And now here is a quote from Navarun Bhattacharya's short story, Halal Jhanda. And now see how I'm not asking you to do away with discourse either. This is a really great passage that shows how the body is constantly transforming into sign and back. যে কথাগুলো আমি বলবো সেগুলো পুরো ছাই হয়ে উড়ে যাচ্ছে, আর সেই গুঁড়ো গুঁড়ো কথার ছাই জলের উপর পড়ছে, আপনাদের ইজ্জতের উপর পড়ছে, আপনাদের সাপ চকচকে জুতোর উপর পড়ছে, শহরের উপর পড়ছে, খাবারের উপর পড়ছে, আকাশের লালার সঙ্গে মিশে রোদ্দুরের ছুরির ফলার উপর মরচে হয়ে জমছে কথাগুলো। কিন্তু এর চেয়েও বড় সওয়াল থেকেই যায়, ইজ্জত আর রুস্তমি কা সওয়াল। পড়ালেখা এত জানি না বলে কথাগুলো এবড়ো খেবড়ো হল্লাবাজ, কিন্তু কথাগুলোকে সেরকম ছুট করালে এখনো দৌড়তে পারে। দৌড়তে দৌড়তে যখন আর দম থাকে না, পাথর খোয়ায় হোঁচট খেয়ে নখ উল্টে কথাগুলো যেখানে থমকে দাঁড়িয়ে যায়, সেই রাস্তায় বৃষ্টির পর রক্ত জমে আছে হাঁটু অবধি, আর একটা খোলা ম্যানহোলের উপর একটা ডাস্টবিন ইট দিয়ে ঘেরা, আর একটা বাঁশের উপর লাল একটা কাপড় বৃষ্টিতে ভিজে ভারী হয়ে ঝুলছে, সেই দিকে তাকিয়ে কথাগুলো হাঁপাতে থাকে। So this is a marvelous passage, as you can see, and I mean it's almost self-explanatory. So see how the words have a movement if we only let it be, right? The echo, the way the la 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 echoes as ha 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 inside the mouth of Friday is much more unsettling than the discursive ambivalence Bhava reads. So what kind of a methodology that we can then conceive of that takes into account this pertinent question of the body upon which all of this is situated, as well as the specificities of the post-colonial that are not always addressed that well by the scholars of medical humanities here. So Spivak, and please read Spivak beyond can the subalterns, right? She has denounced that essay to an extent in the critique of post-colonial reason, and she has written a lot of really great essays after that. So Moving Devi is, for instance, one that I would strongly recommend. Moving Devi, and ghostwriting is one great example as well. So she gives us an idea of ghost dance as a method of reading at the scenes of past, present and future. Why this temporal passage is important? Because if we read, for instance, Kangal Malshad by Navarun, you would see there are all these epigrams from 19th century texts that are present in a 20th century text at the cusp of 21st century. Okay, and all these things are happening at a crematorium, so the past is not gone and its bodies are lying around like all those ashes of words that are flowing from the sky, according to Navarun, right? So let's see how Spivak explains it. The Sioux, which is the name of an indigenous American nation, effort to be haunted by the ancestors rather than treat them as objects of ritual worship is to make the past a future, as it were. The future anterior, not a future present, unquote. It's slightly complex and might appear to be obscure, but it's actually quite simple. So they are worshipping their ancestors. We see that in Things Fall Apart too. We might think that it's a ritual of a very traditional society. So they are just listening to the voice of the ancestor and they are following those. But it's not as simple as that. Because what the ancestors are saying at the moment of the present is a very specific intervention. It's coming from the future and it's also altering the past in a way. It's also altering the interpretation of past texts or past events or everything that has come before. So now you have a very different relation with the past that is being established. So it creates a wormhole in the continuum of time, right? It kind of destabilizes the linearity of time, and then we can move through it. So what does that mean? So then we can see Mera Juta Hai Japani, Patlu Minglistani, etc. in a new light. How that song is taking place in a specific kind of setting that acquires a different meaning. So whatever is jaded from habit. Yeah, হ্যাঁ, রেস্টুরেন্টে গেলে তো আমি একটা দেখবো যে এরকম কলোনিয়াল বিল্ডিং একটা স্টেটসম্যানের আছে, তার পাশে একটু হেঁটে গিয়ে আমি আমিনিয়াতে বিরিয়ানি খেয়ে নেবো এটসেট্রা। বাট দেন if we are destabilized by our ancestors and see a very different Calcutta, when all these different places look similar but different, then we can also imagine a different kind of future, or we can imagine or analyze our present in a different way. ভবিষ্যতের গর্ভ, যে কথাটা ভবিষ্যতের গর্ভে রয়েছে, রাইট? So what does ভবিষ্যতের গর্ভ is so is related to the past, but how can something come from the গর্ভ of ভবিষ্যৎ? So this is a question to think about. Now I will end with a baul songs lyric, just like সপ্ততলায় নবজলের খেলা, জলের মানুষ হৃদয়ে ভৃগুপদ ধরে। Okay, so this is very obscure. সপ্ততলা কি, etc. There can be all these interpretations. Like if we know a little bit of Indian philosophy and Ayurveda, and all these things are absolutely interlinked. Ayurveda does not mean Patanjali's pranayam or Patanjali's dantakanti. It's a very different thing if you really are serious about it. So it's a very bodily description, and as we know that Baul philosophy is Dehovali. It talks about the present, Bortoman Ponti, and Dehovali, and about the body. So these 7 tola or levels, it can refer to the 7 chakras of the body, or 7 dhatus, Osthi, Majja, Shukra, ittadi, Med, Mangsha, ittadi, Saptarishi, ittadi. And that, this is really interesting for me, because water is a feminine principle, and Nobo Joler Khela, Jol is related to the fluid in the womb, as well as it's Nobo Jol, it's like something that is being created new, Notun Joler Khela. Ebong what does that create? That creates Joler Manush who ভৃগু বুকে পদচিহ্ন এঁকে দেয়, মানে যে আর কি ভৃগু হচ্ছে একজন বিখ্যাত ঋষি who has lots of commentaries on the Upanishads, and he famously defines the idea of Brahman, and Brahman is the most disembodied idea possible in Indian philosophy. It's like the pure being that is without any attributes, nirgun, nirakar, and so on and so forth, right? But here that paradigm is entirely reversed. So it starts from the body, from the maternal as well as the carnal, and then that creates the shape of Bhrigu, that creates the idea. So it becomes very different. So maybe that can trigger us into thinking of a new kind of post-colonialism, which is more attuned to the idea of the body. Thank you.
Thank you, Suvendu. Now we have a question and answer session. Those of you who are wondering what is going on, this is what is happening since the last 30 or 40 years or 50 years. Actually, all across the English literature departments in this modern post of a colonial country to the departments in the West, they are trying to connect the word of the level, the order of the discourse, right? Semiotics, science system, language, words, with the material world that surrounds it, from where it emerges, where it is embedded, right? So we are trying to connect the classroom with the world outside. We were so inclined to look at literature as to be consumed privately, right? A poem, a novel, you read in your spare time or in the classroom with greater technical attention. But still, it is restricted to your reading, all right? Or how the critics have read. You are ultimately dealing with the text. There is a world of discourse. But that is where, I mean, other people have been asking this question, right? Are you really useful to us? And of what use are you to society? You are reading your novel, your poem, acting out your plays. There is a very private world of luxury, privilege. Of what use are you? Of what help are you to the world out there? Alright? So this is what the theory, you see, the rise of theory is not for nothing. It is not just a intellectual fashion. Alright? Theory does exactly this. It is trying to connect the text with whatever is happening outside. Alright? You understand this? They are not polar divisions. They are not two entities fundamental entities in structuralism, the art or the whole. Constantly they are impregnating each other. That is post-structuralism. Right? It is not day or night divided. It is not the text or discourse here and the body outside, but they are constantly fusing, impregnating, making a synety sort of thing. That is what he was actually doing, alright? When he was talking of body as a site of many things and how they are being represented in language, in narratives, alright? And such orders, levels of discourse. You all have to walk this way. I mean, English literature, the study of literature is taking this direction only. How to connect the classroom with the world, discourse with body. I mean, language or semiotic sign with material manifestation. Right? If I am not mistaken, Suvendu, perhaps this is the overall structure in which these studies are taking place.
Right, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So now you can please ask him any question. And at the end, Professor Dibakar Sarkar, now he is Dr. Dibakar Sarkar, he is, I think, our first registered PH.D. in the department. He will deliver the formal vote of thanks.
Don't be shy. Even if you think that your question is not important or it's not clever enough or you need to read 10 books before asking the question.
Right.
Don't think.
And sir, I had a question. Diseases were used as a method to colonize the Indians. So could you elaborate on that a bit?
No, I actually didn't say that diseases were used to colonize the Indians. Indians were being colonized from before. There are all sorts of contingent, complex reasons. Disease becomes an occasion for furthering the power of the state. So it penetrates further in Indian society. For instance, now it can use the hospital to take all these data, right? With COVID, what happened? Now they are tracking it. So in the same way, epidemics often become occasions where state flexes its muscles, where state becomes more powerful. That's what I said. That's what basically David Arnold says. So for instance, with the cholera epidemic, they started regulating the way the pilgrims would move, because the pilgrims were supposedly spreading the disease, although they didn't regulate the movement of the army as much. So it's also up to their convenience to an extent, of course. But it becomes an occasion for the state to penetrate further into the society. That's the idea.
So the way for the state to penetrate further into that can be interpreted as a form of colonialism, can it not be?
Yeah, definitely. But it's a colonized society. So, in the case of India, and when we think of colonialism, we might think that, okay, as a system, as a philosophy, it's really complex. It has political unit, it has certain administrative manifestations, it has a philosophy and so on. But we need to remember a simple thing, that colonialism happened across 200 years, right? British colonialism. And many of the things were still emerging just before India became independent. So all of these things did not come together at the same time. So there would be specific moments where a specific thing would be introduced, right? Or where it would kind of acquire a specific intensification. So you are right that it's a colonizing power or it's a colonizing gesture. But that gesture is occasioned by these diseases sometimes in specific ways. Does that make sense?
So thank you.
Kindly introduce yourself.
Okay, so I am Syamantak. I just finished my MA English from University of Hyderabad. So I didn't study here, but I was a student of RAMAKRISHNA in my MG.
So welcome, Syamantak.
Thank you. So my question is, when we talk about any disease, we are basically talking about the vulnerability of the body. So does this vulnerability make us more human, or is it something that destabilizes the discourse that which makes us more than human? For instance, when we are thinking about the great stint of London in Victorian age, when the river Thames turns left, so does it not destabilize the whole locale of London as the center of the colonial world?
It's a very good question. It's a very good question, certainly. So my response would be, actually, see, if you read the order of things, there is a very beautiful passage by Foucault where Foucault says that the human is like a form that was etched on the seashore for a while, just for a flickering moment, and then it gets washed away. So the human is by definition very contingent and vulnerable and everything. And in some way, post-human, which we might think that this is a new fad, this is a new theory and so on, but actually post-human is much more fundamental, or it has always been so. So you are absolutely right that the Great Stink destabilizes the integrity or uniqueness of London as the capital of the world at that point. But at the same time, it also becomes a reflection of how the world actually is. It's not like how we see it in BBC series like Bridgerton and so on, right? The reality is murkier and stinkier, literally. And the Great Stink is only kind of pointing that out in some sense. And if we look within, when we are digesting something, now I am going to give you a very visceral detail, but this is nevertheless true. Our stomachs literally have millions of gut bacteria. And now, because I am, like my field is medical medicine, we are also in contact with people who are working with really advanced kind of medical sciences. Now people are thinking that the health of the gut bacteria or the health of the bacterium in general in the human body, in different places, like even in human skin, that is much more important in shaping lots of things like human cognition, behavior, your moods, and many things, much more than genetics. Actually, more than genes, which are at some level at least certain coded data points from your ancestors. Even more than that, these microscopic beings, these microorganisms, they are now dictating your mood or your health. So, where is the human? I mean, the human is invaded by lots of other creepy crawlies, literally through and through, right?
I have two things to say. The first one is related to your the first part of the presentation, which is you talk about the maternal body, and you also see that in the conceptualization of the maternal itself, there is this disembodied being that is seen as the maternal. For example, we see the Cora, you also see the abyss in the Gilgamesh or in the Rig Veda, we see that the maternal is a feminine, which is disembodied, it is endless, it is a water body that is bottomless, right? From where beings are born and to where beings return after their death. So this lack of measurement, this lack of stratification and this lack of structure itself is like a revolt against the imposition of form or body, which might be seen as a patriarchal movement. And so that's what I want to say.
That's a very good point. Thank you. Actually, you are absolutely right that it's bottomless, it's the abyss, it's the primal darkness, it's the you see, when a male, for instance, because you talked about the Upanishads, etc., whenever the Brahman is described, it's more, and later even Vishnu, Shiva, everyone, they are beyond the gunas, right? They are gunati. But as opposed to that, the Devi is gunadha. So there is a difference. It's the originator of the guna and the guna resides there. As opposed to that, the male kind of godhead is more like someone who goes beyond the guna, right? And that's one way of understanding it would be, yes, it resists the specific contours of the body, the specific mortal body that something takes by being the primal and the limitless and the immeasurable. But also the paradox is every atom of that mortal body is also created by that limitless and that. So it does not. There is no. That's a very Christian notion. When Professor Omananda Sutta taught Christianity, I mean, while talking about Milton, but he also taught Christianity. He used to say that there is always a fundamental, a very narrow but thin crack between the God and the mortal world in the Christian imaginary. That's why Adam and God's fingers do not touch. It can come really close, it can come tantalizingly close, but it never actually touches. But pantheistic religions are somewhat different from that. In that there is no absolute gap between the created world and the creator. That was probably a bit more than what you asked.
Yeah, there's another thing I want to say in the second part of the presentation, which is if I do a reading of Abhiganu Shakuntala and I see that when Dushmanta has come in the grove, Shakuntala is in love and out of desire she falls sick. She is suffered from fever, right? Now this is seen as a erotic prose or whatever. If you do a post-colonial sort of reading of this text and you see Dushmanta is written as the outsider, the colonizer, and the grove itself is the colony which has not been colonized yet. Right? And Dushmanta comes and the female body of Shakuntala falls ill out of sort of fetish, I guess, for the man on the outside. There's also this binary between the grove and the outside because if I remember correctly, the grove doesn't have a rotten leaf. All the streams are pure, all the trees are green, but outside the king's retinue is drinking water from the river which has rotten leaves there. Right? So the cove itself represents the patriarchal, rotten outsider, the colonizer, while the cove is the colonizer.
That's a very good point. Actually, you should write a paper. I mean, you can have you read? I think it's by Bunking. There is an essay called Miranda Shakuntala where he compares all the different. I mean, yeah, that's a very good point. So, and you should also read Romila Thapar's book Shakuntala, where she discusses the Shakuntala character in Mahabharata and in Ghatak, how they are different, why. Yeah, I think I'm amazed by your interpretation. I don't have a specific response. You can write a paper.
আর কোন প্রশ্ন? হাত তোলো, মাইকটা পৌঁছে দেবো।
আর কত প্রশ্ন থাকবে?
আসলে এখানে অনেক ইউজি ওয়ানও আছে যারা সাবজেক্টটাকে এখনো অতটা চিনে উঠতে পারে, তারা সবাই হায়ার সেকেন্ডারি স্টেজ থেকে এসছে তো। প্রশ্ন একটা।
So my name is Amar Rai, I'm a UG service student. In the first half, you had talked about how the body is becoming a sort of object when you refer to transplants, vaccines, and diagnosis. And
Would you be a little louder?
No,
Yes.
Omar is speaking in slightly American accent because actually he's looking in his mirror image. I mean, for the future. He has applied for all American universities. He's a very bright boy, no doubt about it. He's the topper of third year, right?
খুব ভালো।
And he's a prolific presenter of papers all across the world by virtue of internet. Yes.
স্যার আপনি বলছিলেন যে মানে যখন আপনি বললেন যে লাইক দ্য বডি ইজ বিকামিং অ্যান অবজেক্ট, রাইট? তো মানে কিভাবে এক্সটার্নাল ওয়ার্ল্ডের সাথে মানে বডিটা মিশে যাচ্ছে, and যেটা মানে প্রিভিয়াস আমাদের কনসেপ্টটা ছিল যে the mind and the body stand separate, be it from the source of religion, where in Gita we have reference to the shape and the shape Dravya, or if we are taking references from Dibakar, ওই কনসেপ্টটা ভেঙে যাচ্ছে। Now when we are talking about Franz Fanon, while he is referring to the body becoming the object due to the effect of colonization in the Wretched of the Earth, he also refers to how a person, when becoming colonized, finally understands, finally tries to make himself suitable to the colonizer, যাতে নিজে মানে ওই আদারের ডোমেনটা থেকে বেরোতে পারে। But at the same time, the person finally realizes যে মানে he can neither completely extricate the colonizer nor fully become the colonizer. তো সেই ক্ষেত্রে মানে নিজের ডোমেনে, নিজের কান্ট্রির মধ্যে there is the role of violence and there is the role of domination. তো স্যার এরকম একটা ক্ষেত্রে তো মানে বডিটা and মাইন্ডটা একটা সেপারেট কাজ করছে, because primarily the mind was trying to colonize the colonizer, and finally the body's presence is making the mind work in a different fashion altogether, where the body works in a different way all of a sudden. So tahole mane where do we stand? What is your take on this?
And this is a really complex question. So I got up to yes, the colonized cannot extricate from performing certain qualities of the colonizer. So he is like they are mimicking the colonizer and so on. But at the same time that they cannot assimilate with that, right? There is also always a bodily difference. So that's why it becomes an object.
Yes, এবং মানে bodily difference-টা যেটা থাকছে ওটা তুমি মানে primarily bodily difference-টা মানে ওদের primarily একটা মাইন্ডের ডিফারেন্স আছে, ওই মাইন্ডের ডিফারেন্সটার জন্য they were trying to take the position of the colonizer.
না এখানে একটা আমি খুব তোমার প্রশ্নটা তুমি এটা আরো আরেকবার করে পড়ো, অ্যাকচুয়ালি খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট একটা পয়েন্ট যেটা ট্যানজেন্সিয়ালি কোশ্চেনটা রেজড হয়েছে, সেটা হলো যে আফটার অল ফ্যানন দেখবে একটা সেকশন আছে রেচেড অফ দ্য আর্থে a new humanism বলে। It does not come to favor post-humanism because of colonization. He goes for a new humanism. সেটা কি? সেটা হচ্ছে after all, Fanon is a great existential philosopher too. He is in the line of Merleau-Ponty, Sartre and so on. Right? They are his interlocutors too. He's not just kind of angrily writing that whatever happened. So, in existentialism, the primary problem is whenever there are two people, imagine even a very bare setting like waiting for Godot. There is just Estragon and Vladimir initially, but they are self and other of each other. So you are invariably kind of using the other to load all sorts of things, your desires, your kind of the way you assess the self. Which is a mirror, your self is basically constructed always in relation to the other, right? But what colonial violence does actually, why the question of Algeria that essay is called question of Algeria or something, that's a very important essay by but he suggests is through the colonial violence both of them will actually annihilate their initial positions and a new human will be born, which will be neither of those initial premises, neither of those initial selves. So it's very difficult to conceive of an identity politics from Fanon. Fanon does not gives any essential ethical valence upon the colonized. যে তুমি colonized বলে তুমি একদম ভালো জিনিসের পরাকাষ্ঠা আর যে colonizer সেইখানে একদম খারাপ, সে তো বটেই, কিন্তু মানে ব্যাপারটা এরকম নয় যে ওটা জাস্ট আমি গিয়ে ওখানে গিয়ে এটা ইয়ে করলাম বলে ওটা সলভ ওরকম ভাবে হবে না। It will create something new because we'll break through this mirror. That's the main point. So ultimately it's also about going মানে এই যে মাইন্ড আর বডি দিয়ে তুমি যেটা বলছো, it will destabilize this mind body dualism that it initially begins with. That's very true. I agree with that.
ডিস্টেবিলাইজ বলতে স্যার মানে ফাইনালি মাইন্ড আর বডিটা মার্জ করে যাচ্ছে বলছে।
মার্জ করছে না নেসেসারিলি, কিন্তু দুটোই নতুন হচ্ছে। মানে একটা হচ্ছে যে কি বলবো, আর্যদা কি আপনি একটু এক্সপ্লেইন করবেন? আমার মনে হচ্ছে যে আপনি এটা আমার চেয়ে বেটার এক্সপ্লেইন করতে পারবেন। আমি কি বলতে চাইছি আপনি
এটা অভিষেকও ভালো বলতে পারবে। এই যে আমরা যখন এই যে ইন্ডিয়ান যত সিস্টেমস অফ ডান্স, সেখানে কোনটা ফেমিনিন আর কোনটা ম্যাসকুলিন, তাই না? আমরা ভাবতে শিখেছি যে দিস ইজ ট্র্যাডিশনালি পারফর্মড বাই উইমেন, ওটা তো নয়। হ্যাঁ, বলে এই যে বাইনারিজের কনস্ট্যান্ট একটা সিনার্জি, একটা এক্সচেঞ্জ, একটা ইমপ্রেগনেশন, এটা মানে কিন্তু এটাই যে কিছুটা ওর নিলাম, কিছুটা আমার নিলাম, কিছুটা রিজেক্ট করলাম, কনস্ট্যান্ট একটা ইভলিউশন। হ্যাঁ, কনস্ট্যান্ট ইভলিউশন এরকম।
আলটিমেটলি এটা কোনোটা ইনিশিয়াল পজিশন থাকবে না। অঙ্কের মতো ভাবতে পারো, এক্স ওয়াইটা আলাদা হবে, আবার সেটা এক্স ওয়াইটা আবার একটা x1 y1 তৈরি হবে, এরকম করে হতে হতে একটা অন্য কিছু হবে। ওটা আগের মতো কেউই থাকবে না পুরো জিনিসটা। অঙ্ক দিয়ে শেষ অব্দি বুঝে এইটা জিআরিতে ভালো হবে, তোমার হয়ে যাচ্ছে।
I have one more question. In the previous part of your lecture, you mentioned the invisible of the flesh, which is, I believe, a book. And you said that there was a section that said, in the end, the universe and I are in a closed economy in utero. Can you explain that a bit further? I didn't really understand that.
Yeah, that's a great point you raised. So it's from Irigary's commentary on the visible and the invisible, right? It's called the invisible. So what she says is she critiques her teacher Marleponti that although he talks about an embodied cognition, he in some way does not address the fundamental question that is there, that what is the maternal regenerative kind of process that creates this possibility of flesh being a thought object or a thought subject. So what creates the condition of possibility for that embodied cognition? And when that is created, why she is talking about the continuum with the utera is because এই যে আমাদেরকে আগে অভিষেক বলল যে অ্যাবিস বা কেওস বা কোরা, সেটা জাস্ট একটা প্রাইমাল মুহূর্তে তৈরি হয়েছিল বিশ্ব সৃষ্টির সময়, এমন নয় কিন্তু সেটা একটা কন্টিনিউয়াম যেটা প্রত্যেকটা সময়ই আছে,
Existed already.
হ্যাঁ, ইয়েস। সো দ্য প্রবলেম অফ দিস নিউ ফিলোসফি, যেরকম নিউ হিউম্যানের কথা বলছেন তো কেন, সেরকম ওই নিউ ফিলোসফি, সেখানে এই থটটা মানে যেটা আনথট, এমনকি এবং এটা অ্যাকচুয়ালি আমরা ঠিক করে বুঝতে পারবো না ক্রিশ্চিয়ানিটি একটু না বুঝলে। এটা নিয়ে আরো অনেক ব্যাপার আছে, যেমন এই যে ভার্জিন মেরির যেরকম ভাবে, যেটা তুমি যদি স্ট্যাবার্ট ম্যাটার করো, জুলিয়া ক্রিস্টিভার, কারণ অল অফ দিস পিপল আর ইন ডায়ালগ উইথ ইচ আদার, দে আর রাইটিং এট দ্য সেম টাইম, দে আর ইন্টারলোকিউটার্স উইথ ইচ আদার। সেখানেও এই ধারণাটা আছে যে এই যে স্পিচ, যে একটা স্পিচ এলো, তারপরে একটা ভেসেল ভার্জিন মেরি, সেখানে এসে একটা ইম্যাকুলেট বার্থ ক্রিয়েট করছে। কিন্তু ক্রিশ্চিয়ানিটির অনেক অন্য যে ইয়েগুলো, অন্য যে ধারাগুলো ক্রিশ্চিয়ানিটির মধ্যেও, যেমন এই যে ঈসা কথা কামস ফ্রম স্ক্যান্ডিনেভিয়ান রুন, এরকম অনেক কিছু আছে যেগুলো ক্রিশ্চিয়ানিটির সময়ের নয় এবং ওর ভেতর দিয়ে পেগানিজম আছে কনসিডারেবল। তো এবার সেইগুলো মানে ম্যাটারনাল বা কার্নাল বা ফেমিনাইন যেটা, সেটা হচ্ছে এই টেম্পোরালিটিটা যে কখনোই চলে যাচ্ছে না, বা সবসময় প্রত্যেক মুহূর্তে উই আর থিঙ্কিং দ্যাট এই ক্লাসরুমটা স্টেবল, এখানে আইডিয়ার এক্সচেঞ্জ হচ্ছে, হঠাৎ এখানে ভূমিকম্প হয়ে আমরা মারা যেতে পারি। So the maternal and the chaotic and the primal is always brewing everywhere, in inside our gut, outside this window, everywhere. এটা প্রচন্ড একটা এক্সট্রিম এক্সাম্পল দিলাম, কিন্তু ব্যাপারটা এরকমই। তারপরে এই যে ফিলোসফির এই যে ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজ থেকে ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজ যে কন্টিনিউয়ামটা, সেটা অ্যাকচুয়ালি প্রচন্ড ফ্র্যাজাইল একটা কন্টিনিউয়াম দ্যাট ক্যান বি কাট অফ অ্যাট এনি পয়েন্ট। এই যে কালি দেখছো সবের উপর দাঁড়িয়ে আছে কেন? কন্টিনিউয়াস টাইম which is then cut by the time of the kairos, time of the crisis, but which is also the possibility of a new beginning.
আপনি
বসো
স্যার কালিফোর্নিয়ার ফ্যানানের যে আপনি নিউ ম্যানের একটা ওইটা কি আরেকবার একটু করুন, তারপরে প্রশ্নটা করছি মানে
হ্যাঁ, ওটা হচ্ছে ওই আর্যদা যেটা খুব ভালো এক্সপ্লেন করলেন, যে ধরো ডায়ালেকটিক, এটা হচ্ছে ডায়ালেকটিক্যাল মেথড, মানে ওয়েস্টার্ন ফিলোসফির খুব ফান্ডামেন্টাল জিনিস হচ্ছে ডায়ালেকটিক, যেখানে তুমি একটা ইনিশিয়াল প্রেমিস দিচ্ছ, আমি একটা ইনিশিয়াল প্রেমিস দিচ্ছি, এবার এই প্রেমিসেরা যখন ইন্টারঅ্যাক্ট করবে তখন দুটোই বদলাচ্ছে ভেতর থেকে, কেউই আর তার ইনিশিয়াল স্টেটে থাকছে না। সো এই ভায়োলেন্সটা হচ্ছে কিছুটা একটা অ্যানিহিলেটরি ফোর্স, যেটার ফলে মানে এখনো এক্সচেঞ্জ হচ্ছে কন্টিনিউয়াস, মানে যেটা প্রেম দিয়ে ঘটছে বৃন্দাবনে, সেটা এখানে হেট্রেড ভায়োলেন্স দিয়ে ঘটছে, কিন্তু ইটস অলসো আ কাইন্ড অফ আ লীলা লাইক স্ট্রাকচার, যেটা হচ্ছে একদম আলটিমেট বোমা মেরে হচ্ছে, কিন্তু ব্যাপারটা হচ্ছে তাই একদম সেম। ঠিক আছে, মানে যেখানে দুজন ক্রমশ এবং দুজনই পরস্পরকে অ্যানিহিলেট করে একটা কিছু নতুন হিউম্যান তৈরি হবে। ওই জন্য ওই প্রবন্ধটা ফ্যানানের প্রচন্ড কন্ট্রোভার্সিয়াল এবং বহুদিন অবধি বহু ইউনিভার্সিটিতে ব্যান্ড ছিল এই কোয়েশ্চেন অফ আলজেরিয়া।
তাই আমি বলার চেষ্টা করছিলাম অভিষেককে যে রাধা ও কৃষ্ণে একজনকে বলা হয় তো কালো, একজন গৌরী, তা এইরকম মুদ্রা আছে যেখানে অর্ধেকটা রাধা অর্ধেকটা কৃষ্ণ, ওটা ওরকম একটা ইভলিউশনারি একটা স্টেজ, যেখানে আমি কিছুদিন পুরোটা কালো, আবার কেউ পুরোটা গৌরী, and the meaning, the march, এটা রয়েছে রাধা কৃষ্ণ সলিউশন। তো ওদের যে বিভিন্ন মুদ্রার যে এই যে আইকনোগ্রাফিক্যাল রিপ্রেজেন্টেশন আছে, তাদের এটা
স্যার এবার আমি যেটা বলছি, এই যে আমি জানি না প্রশ্নটা আমি কি করছি, সেটা হচ্ছে এই কনসেপ্টের সাথে ধরুন নিক্সিয়ান আইডিওলজিতে যেটা ক্ষেত্রে ট্রান্সভ্যালুয়েশন অফ ভ্যালু আর সুপারম্যানের যে কনসেপ্টটা, এটা কি কোনোভাবে ইকুয়েট করা যেতে পারে?
এইগুলো খুব, এই ধরনের প্রশ্ন হচ্ছে খুব ট্রিকি, কারণ আমি রিসেন্টলি নিক্সে পড়িনি প্রথমত, দ্বিতীয়ত হচ্ছে যে এটা এবার সেই জন্য আর কি, মানে এটা খুব সঠিক অর্থ উত্তর দেওয়া আমার পক্ষে সম্ভব না। এবার নিটসে একরকমের জিনিওলজির কথা এবং ওই মানে গুড ইভিল যেটা আর কি ইনিশিয়াল ভাবে সমাজে রয়েছে, তার পিছনে গিয়ে এটা কোথাও দুটোই আর কি হিস্টোরিক্যালি সিচুয়েটেড বা কোনোটাই অরিজিনালি নয়, এই ধরনের সমস্ত আর্গুমেন্ট থাকে। কিন্তু নিটসের ফিলোসফিক্যাল মেথড, আমরা যেহেতু এখানে মেথডের কথা বলছি তো টু অ্যান এক্সটেন্ট, নিটসের ফিলোসফিক্যাল মেথড ইজ ফান্ডামেন্টালি ডিফারেন্ট ফ্রম দ্য ডায়ালেক্টিক্যাল মেথড। Nietzsche comes from a tradition of writing fragments, যেটা শেষ বড় ফিলোসফার হচ্ছেন ওয়াল্টার বেঞ্জামিন, বাট ইটস আ ভেরি ডিফারেন্ট ফিলোসফিক্যাল ট্র্যাডিশন। সূত্র, ইন্ডিয়ান ফিলোসফির সূত্র খুব ছোট্ট মধ্যে বলা হবে, যেটার মধ্যে একটা ইনিশিয়াল কিছু, যেমন ঈশোপনিষদে আছে একটা বিখ্যাত সূত্র, প্রচন্ড ডিস্টেবিলাইজ। যেমন এখন আগে আমি পুরো সংস্কৃতটাই বলতে পারতাম, আমরা ভুলে গেছি বলে বাংলায় বলছি। সেটা হচ্ছে যে বিদ্যার উপাসনা, যে অবিদ্যার উপাসনা করে সে অন্ধকারে প্রবেশ করে, যে বিদ্যার উপাসনা করে সে ততোধিক অন্ধকারে প্রবেশ করে। এটা ঈশোপনিষদে আছে। এর মানে কি? তো সক্রেটিস হচ্ছে এই ফ্র্যাগমেন্টের মানে ওয়েস্টার্ন ফিলোসফিতে জনক, যে তোমাকে খাটিয়ে দেবে আর কি বলে যে তুমি আচ্ছা তুমি এরকম মনে করো তাহলে এটা কি কেন এরকম। তো নিটশের স্টান্সটা বা লেখার ফিলোসফি লেখার স্টাইলটা কিন্তু ওরকম, ইটস নট দ্য ডায়ালেকটিক্যাল পস্টার, ইটস আ ডিফারেন্ট ফিলোসফিক্যাল মেথড।
Sir, আমাদের নিউ হিউম্যান নিয়ে একটা might not be related, but you go into when two ends meet and they create a new human being entirely through struggle. So can we ask, can we say that through the struggle of freedom in India, both the English and the Indians were left completely changed from what they initially were?
Absolutely, absolutely they changed. Just not through the freedom fight, মানে থ্রু কলোনাইজেশন। তুমি যখন থেকে ওই সময় থেকে যে কোনো টেক্সট যেগুলো ধরো অরিজিন হচ্ছে ব্রিটিশ ডিটেকটিভ, ওয়ান অফ দ্য মোস্ট ব্রিটিশ অফ নভেলিস্টিক জনরা ডিটেকটিভ ফিকশন। ডিটেকটিভ ফিকশন প্রথম কি, হোয়াট ইজ দ্য ফার্স্ট? ইটস উইলকি কলিন্সেস দ্য মুনস্টোন। And what is that moonstone? It is the stone of Vishnu, which was part of Tipu Sultan's sword, which was then taken by a British general into Britain, which then creates a whole trail of things. But so the এইরকম ভাবে যদি ধরো প্রথম যেটা সাইকোজিওগ্রাফি, যেখানে প্রথম সাইকোলজিক্যাল একটা ভাবে স্পেসকে রিপ্রেজেন্ট করা হচ্ছে, তো এটা হচ্ছে ডি কুইন্সিস কনফেশনস অফ অ্যান ইংলিশ ওপিয়াম ডেলার। সেখানে এই মাইন্ডের যে আনকনসিয়াস স্পেসগুলো সেগুলোর মেটাফোর বা মেটোনিমি কি ওরিয়েন্ট, চায়না, প্যাগোডা, বিষ্ণু সেখানে অনন্তকাল ধরে শুয়ে আছে ইত্যাদি। সো ইট হ্যাজ চেঞ্জড ইউরোপিয়ান লিটারেচার অ্যাট লার্জ ফ্রম দ্য 17th সেঞ্চুরি। ওই জন্য তার আগে যে মিডিয়েভাল রেনেসান্সের একটু যখন শুরু হচ্ছে সেটাও কন্ট্রোভার্সিয়াল। লিসা জার্ডিন ইত্যাদি অনেকে দেখিয়েছেন যে ওখানে অটোমান আসে প্রভাবিত। আপ টু অ্যাবাউট হয়তো 10th 11th সেঞ্চুরি একটা কনসলিডেটেড ফেজ একটা ইউরোপিয়ান সিভিলাইজেশন পাওয়া যায়,
মানে জাস্ট পিওরলি ইউরোপিয়ান।
হ্যাঁ কিছুটা হ্যাঁ, মানে সেটার মধ্যে গ্রিক টিক থাকলেও সেটা অনেক দিন ধরে ডেভেলপ করেছে সিম্পলি বিকজ দে ওয়্যার ফিনান্সিয়ালি পুয়ার, দে ওয়্যার পুয়ার অফ দ্য ওয়ার্ল্ড and they were cut off civilization from many other.
They had no influence from the east.
হ্যাঁ, মানে there were influences of course, কিন্তু ইনফ্লুয়েন্স তো পয়সা থাকলে হয়। এই যে ইন্ডিয়ান, আমরা এই যে ইন্ডিয়ান ধরে যত কিছু ভাবছি যে আচ্ছা ইন্ডিয়া থেকে সবকিছু সারা বিশ্বে যাচ্ছে, ব্যাপারটা কিন্তু ওরকম নয়। এই যে সরস্বতী, সিদ্ধমাতৃকা ইত্যাদি এগুলো সব সাউথ ইস্ট এশিয়ায় আছে, অন্য অনেক জায়গাতেও আছে। তো আমি নিশ্চিত যে ইন্ডিয়ান বলে যেগুলো চলছে সেগুলো এত নানা ধরনের জিনিস ইন্ডিয়া এসেছিল সিম্পলি বিকজ India was an economic powerhouse for about 1000 years, if not more. That's why there are so much complexity in Indian culture, simply because of that reason. Lots of different people came and went through India. It's very simple. সেরকম ভাবে European civilization will find its efflorescence only when it will become a financial powerhouse.
Industrial
revolution এবং তার আগে মার্কেন্টাইল। ইন্ডাস্ট্রিয়াল রেভলিউশন হচ্ছে একটা স্ট্রম্যান, কিন্তু তার আগে মূল ঘটে যাচ্ছে মার্কেন্টাইল পাইরেসি, পাতি মার, মানে পুরো ইটালিয়ান আর এইসব স্প্যানিশ পাইরেটদেরকে মেরে উড়িয়ে দিচ্ছে ব্রিটিশ এরা, এবং এইসব স্প্যানিশ গোল্ড ফোল্ড নিয়ে আরো অনেক মার্কি হিস্ট্রি রয়েছে, তার সঙ্গে স্লেভারি।
মুনস্টোন নিয়ে আর্গুমেন্টটা একটা কমপ্লিট।
হ্যাঁ, তো মুনস্টোন নিয়ে মাই আর্গুমেন্ট ইজ and you see that the whole, there are all sorts of things, like all these characters are kind of enthralled, they are doing certain things which they don't know they have done, like the person who has actually stolen the moonstone, সে তো এমনিতে খুব সৎ লোক, but he has done that stealing under some kind of a spell. তো এরকম ভাবে ফান্ডামেন্টাল যেগুলো মানে ইম্পিরিয়াল সেলফের খুব বেসিক জায়গা, যেগুলোর উপর ম্যাকলের পুরো থিসিস ইত্যাদি দাঁড়িয়ে, যে এজেন্সি, রেশনালিটি, they are completely destabilized in these literary texts. এবং সেখানে দুটো কি ফ্যাক্টর, একটা হচ্ছে সেখানে মুনস্টোন আছে ইন্ডিয়ান এবং কয়েকজন ব্রাহ্মণ ঘুরে বেড়াচ্ছে চারদিকে, তারা এটা ওটা রিড করছে, and there is a very important Caribbean doctor who is a mixed blood and slightly feminized Ezra Jennings. He has a very weird physiognomic description, like half of his hair for instance is straight and whitish, half of it is curly and black. He looks perpetually kind of intoxicated, because he takes opium, but at the same time he has some kind of a penetrating glint in his eyes. এরকম ভাবে দেখতে পাবে যে এই যে বান্ডেল অফ কন্ট্রাডিকশন, এবং যারা এই ধরনের মানে ট্রু আর কি অ্যাম্বিভ্যালেন্স, যেটা ভাবা বলছেন কথাটা ঠিকই, কিন্তু সেই অ্যাম্বিভ্যালেন্সটা এত বেশি ভিসেরাল এবং সেটা এত বেশি, সেই জন্য এত বেশি ডিস্টেবিলাইজিং, এবং সেটা এত বেশি আর কি এবং সেটা দিয়েই কিন্তু এই জনরাটা তৈরি হচ্ছে। সেটাই হচ্ছে who done it. The whole question of detection is basically this question of imperial, looking for the sign of empire, trailing the trail of the empire. সেই জন্য যত বড় বড় কাল্ট ডিটেকটিভ স্টোরি, সেগুলোর মধ্যে কিন্তু কোনো না কোনো একটা কিছু, এইখান থেকে বিষ যাচ্ছে, সেইখানে ওরিয়েন্টাল এক্সপ্রেসে মার্ডার হচ্ছে, সেখানে গিয়ে এই হচ্ছে। আবার তোমরা এখানেও যদি দেখো সত্যান্বেষী ইত্যাদি, মানে আমাদের ব্যোমকেশেও প্রচুর এই যে চাইনিজ আন্ডারওয়ার্ল্ডের গল্প রয়েছে। কারণ কলকাতার তখন ইয়েটাই হচ্ছে ওরকম, জাপানিরা আসছে, এইখান দিয়ে অস্ত্র যাচ্ছে, সেখান দিয়ে মাকড়সার রস দিয়ে বিষ ঢুকছে, না। So detective fiction is a genre that is totally connected with geopolitics. Absolutely.
And the notion of this anxiety.
Anxiety.
যেটা পরে ইএম ফস্টারের মেসেজ টু ইন্ডিয়া ওই কেভে গিয়ে তার একটা ফুল ফ্লাওয়ার। I think we have come to an end of a very, what shall I say, engaging discussion. All right. I found some of you were dozing off, but many is to direct or sat direct. All right. The second half to listen to Suvendu. All right. Thank you so much for having this patience. I now request Professor Dibakar to deliver the formal vote of thanks.
Now we come to the end of this, I would say, thought-provoking talk. And I thank Suvendu for being with us today. And I really liked the way he has mixed his new world knowledge with the previous one. Now, in the break I was saying to him that like a migratory bird, you keep coming back to your nest. Whenever he finds time, it's very gracious of him. He keeps coming back. And students, you may draw inspiration from this lanky figure. Someday, you also may work your way up to the podium as well. And we'll be very glad to arrange your talks in future. Thank you. Thank you for being with us. Suvendu, special thanks. Thank you, students. Thank you.
Thank you.